I think just about everyone's commented on no snow today. Swung the pendulum the other way. And it's easier to get here. Thank you for being here. I know several of you attended the Northern Water Seminar. I hope that's interesting enough for you. Fascinating enough that I know I saw like 6 members of the past cohorts there. And they kind of are stuck on it now. So for you all that kind of get away from these kind of conversations, just keep those meetings in mind. It's a good way to catch up on what's going on. David attended a roundtable meeting. It sounds like he went to an interesting one. They're talking about some legislation, post legislation. And when you start talking about getting outside the prior appropriation doctrine, it always is a human conversation. So it's been interesting. Last month, we talked about the environment. And I love it. You all get it, right? Collaboration, cooperation in whatever you do in water is going to get you farther along. And I so appreciate the comments that you put out there. Some of you asked questions that I want you to ask today. Things like, why can't these different water systems just combine to one entity? Wouldn't that be more efficient? You're going to hear from a lot of different towns and the Tri-State Water District about what they do and where that water comes from. So I think you'll find that really fascinating. Let's see. One other thing I was going to mention. Yeah. Here are okay. We have 3 exciting book reports coming your way. The meeting next May will be our last class. We have gotten the gal from PNC. She will come, and her name Diana. Thank you, Diana Lane. I'm having a senior moment today. You know, I woke up feeling hungover and I have no good reason for feeling hungover. So Diane Lane is going to come. She's just an inspirational speaker, so you will not have missed her. We're going to have a conversation on justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. The Water Center has just hired a person to focus on that with respect to water, so you'll hear her today. Graduation is in May. You should have all gotten the announcement, invitation. Be sure to RSVP. We invite all the cohorts, so hopefully some of the cohorts from the past come. Those of you that went to the dairy, Rob Graves, his daughter, his daughter was in our class last year. So it's a party, you know. Bring your significant other. If you don't have significant other, bring your son.
I had fun explaining to the instrument technicians at our plants what the round paper charts were.
Huh.
And they're looking at me like I have 2 heads. These kids.
I've never seen it before. I've never seen a round paper chart before.
Oh, yeah, you're way too young.
Yeah, kind of like a slider. I mean,
You read it,
yeah.
Nope.
All right, so it's been an interesting class. I want you all to think about how you want to stay in touch. We're going to start with book reports, and Brett, I think you're up.
Sure. I'll stand, maybe, I guess. Mine wasn't one of the 3 interesting ones, so I'm not sure who the 4th person one is today. We'll go through it. So mine was a book, Life of Benjamin Eaton Harrison, written in water. The reason why I picked it is, number 1, it was the least thick of what. The other part of that is I think, as we've discussed before, as my position as Director of Municipal Services, Eaton is one of the towns we serve as the town engineer. So that corridor over there, you always hear about these kind of things. I always find it interesting down the road of most towns and cities come after someone. So in this book. It's kind of interesting trying to determine when towns were named when they were. There was references to Brush, couple brothers and Sterling, and you start looking at all these and you're like, holy moly, Camp Collins before it was Fort Collins. So I didn't do a slide, it would have just been a picture of Benjamin Eaton. And I'll just it's a lot of dates and things that occurred, so I can spend 10 minutes going through dates, but you won't remember them. But I think overall, what was very impactful is he was actually born in Ohio. He's not a native of Colorado. He was born in 1833, holy moly. But the amount of things he did in his 71 years of life is absolutely incredible when you're thinking about back then, no technology, those kind of things. And I'm sitting there looking at myself being over 50, and it's like the things he did, I think I've thought about it and it stresses me out, and the things he did. So I'm just going to kind of briefly go over his life. It is a mix of so much more than just water. Obviously, he was a big influence here. And I'll kind of just go through some of the highlights and then whatever questions, and I'll probably miss things as well. This is not on Audible. I know Ben's not here, but we had that kind of joke a couple months ago. This is now not published anymore. I was going to get my own version, but the going rate for this book is between $150 and $200. So Ben, I'm giving this to you as soon as this meeting's over. So, I've had to keep that in my safe for quite a while. So anyway, so he's born in Ohio. A little bit of background around that time. Ohio was considered, landlocked's not the word, but just with so much vegetation, they were working on the canals up in that area. And so he got involved at an early age as a surveyor for the railroads. So it's like, holy moly, this guy's starting out as like an engineer or something. This is cool. He got married at 23 years old, and basically was doing farming like everyone else did, kind of in the Midwest. And they got married. He had a son, Aaron, in 57. Ultimately, what came down is there was a group of folks that wanted to move on. It was called the Pipe. No, that was in Iowa. So he went to Iowa. To Ohio, he went out on his own, bought a bunch of land in Iowa. That's where he was going to settle. It was beautiful. Then there was a group of people, again, just moving west, right, that everyone's heard about. There's an expedition that was going to head out towards Pikes Peak. So he decided he was going to then go do that. During this time, his son, after his wife had died, had stayed back and never traveled with him through all these durations of things. So yeah, he went to Iowa for a while, got a large farm, and then decided to settle down with the life of farming. Obviously, he had an itch and wanted to do more, keep expanding, which was kind of cool. So he went on the Pikes Peak expedition. And so that was to get, the intention of those expeditions was primarily focused on mining. So that was really that reason to come to Colorado, was focused on mining and looking for gold. So in large part, the large group from Iowa came together, went out to Colorado to look. There wasn't really the opportunities they thought. And the majority, if not all, except for him and one other, went back to Iowa and said, forget it. So he decided to stay, wandered around Colorado for a while, worked his way down south to New Mexico. That's where he started finding how the San Juan Valley was doing with irrigation. We've had those meetings of just the stuff that they've done down there is just amazing. So he learned a little bit about that. He went and was involved as a volunteer with Kit Carson during the Civil War. So he just decided, why not do that for a couple of years? It's amazing. It's amazing. I mean, nowadays you see generation of people can't stay in one job or in one location for more than 2 years. But when you think about how people settled and grew up and lived and all families and married in one place, how much he had moved around was just amazing. So we went and did that and started experimenting with irrigation ditches. Sure, that's fine. So by that time, like I say, this is only 30 years in, and he's done most of the searching for gold, all this as part of the Civil War campaign, all before he's even 30. And it's just like, man, this is crazy, you know, saddling up a bunch of people going, you don't know where. We rely on Google Maps or Apple Maps nowadays. I thought I was old looking at Rand McNally maps, and when they're just trying to plot their own. It's kind of amazing. So anyways, he had gotten remarried later, and really had an affinity for northern Colorado. And so at that point, he kind of settled, bought a lot of land. He actually purchased 25,000 acres of subsidy lands that come from Union Pacific. So during this time, then this is where everything, his name tends to be tied to everything, it seems like at this point. So those that have been around here long enough, you know, the area used to be very heavy in sugar beet industry. The last remaining one is in Fort Morgan. But he brought that in. So a lot of his farming expertise, I guess you would call it a hobby. He was constantly experimenting with seeds from other places, seeing what was working. A lot of that was going on up at Camp Collins. Trying to figure out how that works. So that's kind of what really started the sugar beet industry, which helped facilitate everything kind of goes and flow. That's where the irrigation came into be. He was one of the primary people that was involved in establishing Union Colony, later Greeley. He was involved in that in a lot of areas. Obviously got done with that, decided to be governor down in Denver. Yeah, it was just amazing. So, even in his political, he was there for 1 term, 2 years. But he was justice of the peace. He was a commissioner for Weld County. He was a territorial legislator, territorial senate. Again, at this point, he's only, in 1884, he was governor, and at this point, he's only 51. I don't know, man, it's crazy. So to focus back on the water, just things, many of you guys have kind of heard of them, but where he was involved one way or the other. He ended up dying in 1904, but Mill Power Canal, Larimer and Weld Canal, he was involved in that. Greeley number 2 ditch, Greeley number 3, but again, a lot of this was trial and error that he was involved in. The High Line Canal, that's down by Denver. That was in 1880, so Windsor Reservoir. And then again, we talked about the sugar beet industry that was very big and all that. He is one of 16 people that are part, if you ever spend time in the Capitol, he's one of the 16 that's in the dome up there as well. So, but I was actually more impressed. I think half this book is just the sources that were used to put this book together. And it was just amazing. And I'm sure there's even more involvement of him specifically, but it was a lot of dates, a lot of times. I know it's very high level, but anything you mentioned, he was probably tied to it one way or the other, either as a developer, a planner, a farmer, involved in irrigation, negotiating all the time on what the cost of things were. But the one thing I wanted to mention, I think Sally and I were kind of talking about it, with my realm that tends to be, I've grown to love being on the government side. I know a lot of people hate that, but I know there's a lot of government people in here. So I like the private side where I can have a beer in the fridge at the office, which you can't do on the government side. But the other time I like helping them out because really they're the ones that the public looks to. But it's interesting, you know, we were talking about what we see as regulators and officials and the public relies on us. Codes just get bigger. Regulations get bigger, and rarely do you ever see something saying we don't need this anymore and being removed. And I've had that in my mind for a long time. That's why I like working for the small communities like Eaton or Nunn or Platteville, because they keep it simple. They don't have the resources to have a water resource engineer or even a town manager for a lot of them. And so they're not able to collaborate at the Northern Water Symposiums. They can't go to those things. They have one person trying to do a million different things. And I think that's for those other communities, some are very good with collaborating. in sharing those resources. But he had made an interesting point when he was governor. See if I can find it now. And really the statement was, it is not required that the volume of our laws should be greatly increased. Simplifying and perfecting is what they mostly need. And interesting, we're thinking this is back in 1800s. Our excellent constitution and our no less excellent body of laws have now been on trial long enough to disclose their defects and discords. So it's funny, even back then, they thought they had everything figured out, right? But I think that's the point. And so I think we all see that in the social media, someone will bring up, and I know in Windsor and other places, there's always some arbitrary thing in the code that no one removes. And what I use as an example, someone will say, hey, do you know it's illegal to walk your pet alligator across the street in Windsor? But no one wants to remove it. But it sits in there, and I think that's the point. Everyone's trying to build on something else when it goes back to what's really, and that's how I am. What's the fundamental problem? Is it a one-off? Is it that David and Hartford Homes did one crazy thing that we now do a new law for it that no one else is going to ever be impacted by? Or is it something that just the community needs as a whole so that they can argue? The other part that they had mentioned in relation to that I think is very important from government as well, as he had put in the cost of publication may be argued against the method of the rules, but it is to be considered that we better pay $1 to the newspaper for enlightening the people than a dime to sheriff in opposing them. Basically making, in my mind, don't make the rules so complicated that no one understands them, and then you have the police and everyone else trying to justify that purpose. So it was just interesting to see that vision with all the things he did, and I don't know if it was his experience or whatever, but for something for 70 years old, the stuff he did across the country and the impacts he made was amazing. So I don't take questions. So you just have to follow your nose.
It's always fun to hear about where the names of towns came from. I have no idea where Cheyenne came from.
I'm pretty sure Severance is a typo. If you ever look up the history of it, they have plaque in the city hall, did a project there years ago, but I think his name was David. Severance had applied to name the town something totally different, and somebody in the capital like would put their name on it instead, and the town was named Severance.
Well, the town I live in, Bellevue is the type, Bellevue, if you know your Spanish, should have an E in the middle, and we don't. And so the original postmaster was apparently illiterate in Spanish and, named Bellevue.
All right, Heidi, you're up.
Okay. How many have read this one?
A billion years
Bunch of
ago.
them, bunch of you, yeah. You can see, it's not a small book. And so I'm not gonna do it justice. I'll just share that with you. I will try to fly through and give you just a sampling for what James Michener so eloquently can say. And I'm gonna read from the book because he says it better than anything I could ever share with you. He did write this book in 1974. And the preface of the book is that he was hired by a newspaper to send back articles and go find out what's going on. It is a story that's based on real occurrences, although it is a fictional, well-written novel, right? Inspired by true events. Some of them are listed here, and true people. So there's a lot of things that resonated with me as I read through the book that we've learned here in class. Of course, you can watch the mini series, but don't do that. Just read the book because it's really, really well written. There are 14 chapters, so I'm going to combine a bunch of them together. The first 3 chapters, the land, the inhabitants, and the mini coups of Lane Beaver, are the traditional Michener approach to sharing things about geology and dinosaurs and just how it was that the original indigenous people here came to be and what their relationships were with the land and how they were thinking about it. Really cool to read. You should read that one. Really cool. The real first chapter that has the beginnings of some story, some semblance of who the characters are gonna be in the book is the Yellow Apron. I don't have a quote from this one, but I will share with you how he describes the river. And it truly is apparent that he has a love affair with the river. Now, for the first time, we come to the river, which will command our attention for the remainder of the story. It was born coincident with the rise of the New Rockies, called into being carrying rainfall and melting snow down from the heights. For millions of years, it was not the dominant river of the region. In fact, 5 competing rivers led eastward from the Rockies. Their long abandoned courses still are discernible in the drylands. They lost their identity because of a peculiarity. An arm of our river began to cut southward along the edge of the mountain range. And in doing so, it captured one after another of the competing rivers until they no longer ran eastward as independent rivers, but coalesced to form the South Platte. And the book is really focusing on the Platte. This chapter talks about beaver trappers coming up from Missouri, the white man being introduced into the West, and the battles that are happening as they're trying to negotiate who's on what land and how can white immigrants be living in harmony or trying to live in harmony with the indigenous people. The wagon and the elephant is the longest chapter in the book, and it really is the beginnings of the characters who migrate and settle and become some of the first settlers in Colorado. Coming along from Pennsylvania, the butcher, the migrants, coming along, having to take a boat, a flatbed boat down the Ohio River to meet the Mississippi, to then meet the Missouri, and all the adventures that happened with horse and wagon, eventually joining the Oregon Trail and ending up at Fort John, which is Fort Laramie. The elephant part of the story is all the myths about what's going to happen to you when you reach the mountains of the West. And if you see this elephant, you better turn around and go home. He says, this is one of the stories about traversing with horse and wagon all of these rivers. July 16th, Tuesday. It was dusk when we finished, and the men, wet and muddy, went to their several wagons and collapsed. Some slept on the ground just as they fell, too exhausted to care for themselves. One of the strangers who swam the river so many times with the ropes vomited for the better part of half an hour with nothing coming up and then fainted. Levi, who swam the oxen across the river 16 times and the mules 4, had nothing to say, nor could he eat. But about midnight, he did a strange thing. He asked me to put on an old dress and take off my shoes, and he led me down to the river. He made me go in and duck my head under the water, and I could hear the river moving sand and gravel and even large rocks along the bottom. And Levi said, "It's alive, and it mighty near trapped us." So it was quite an adventure to go across. The next 2 chapters are the massacre and the cowboys. And so this is a story around the native tribes, even among themselves, trying to figure out who was going to have what land where and how they were going to live in harmony when the white man was coming in. This is a lot around the Sand Creek Massacre, which if you have not been down to the Denver Museum of History, they've got wonderful displays there all the time. You can really learn a lot about what happened there. And then it talks about while all this is going on with the indigenous people and the beaver trappers and some of the farmers who were trying to come in and farm land, that cattle were beginning to come in. And they're coming in from Texas across the barren wastelands that the river going dry and being so saline and just being toxic to even drink, trying to migrate the cattle around these precarious locations that were marked by skulls so that you knew, don't drink this water. the Zent family that had migrated in the previous chapter across from Pennsylvania, who were once the original heroes of this area, are now traders because they are trying to live in harmony with the native people. And we weren't going to share in any of this water. Here's how the sharing of water goes. My hope is that with this treaty, we'll be able to arrange a truce. Land along the Platte for the white farmer, empty lands like this for the Indian and his buffalo. You think land like this can ever be farmed? Zent asked. Never. This is a desert. And I think that if we can arrange a treaty now, rather than wage a war against the Indians 5 years from now, it'll cost our government a lot less money in the long run. So even having a projection that this was going to be a long-term issue. The next couple of chapters are the hunters and the smell of sheep. Apparently sheep smell bad. In case you want to know, and even the cows know that, so, yeah. But this is a little bit of the story of some of these original farmers and settlers coming in and getting that sense of gold, hearing gold is in the mountains, going up to try to find gold, and then discovering, yeah, there's no gold, and we're starving. We need to start farming. We need to start growing crops. So the first water rights are coming about in these chapters. This in smell of sheep. He strode along the river for so long and with such intensity that he became the river. He moved with it, felt it in his bones. He sensed each nuance of the flow through the year, and slowly he began to visualize this noble river as a unit, an exposed artery with channels flowing out and back from all directions. It held the land together and made it viable. One day he developed an image of himself standing on dry land and pulling the river and all its tributaries up by the roots. And what was left was an empty canal. And from that conceit, he began to formulate his concept of the Platte. It's not a river, he told his family with excitement, dancing in his eyes. It's a canal put there to bring water to the land that needs it. I don't know how you say it better than that. I don't have any quotes from these couple of chapters, The Crime in the Central Beat. If you like a good murder mystery and you want to know where they put the body, you want to read The Crime in the Central Beat about the entertainers and murders there. The Central Beat talks a lot about farming transitioning to this beet farming and the fact that many hands were needed. So they brought in many different kinds of immigrants into the area, Russians, Italians, Germans, Mexicans, and the fact that there was a Mexican Revolution going on at the time. There was an influx of who's the best worker and how are we going to establish communities coming in. He says, and this was with regard to, because there was a continuous influx of Easterners who wanted to farm the land, they had 10 principles which would revolutionize the West. The second principle is you can never catch or store enough water in 1 year to grow a good crop. Therefore, you must allow about 60% of your land to lie fallow. If you've been farming 80 acres in Iowa, plan to farm at least 320 out here and allow most of it to rest and accumulate water. The fifth principle is, whenever it rains, you must do two things. Fall on your knees and thank God, then jump up, harness your horses to the disc, and turn the field over while the last drops are falling. This will throw a mulch that traps the water. If you wait till tomorrow before you disc, half the water will evaporate. So you can see this was in 1903, 1919, 1950. They understood the value of water. These are the last two chapters, the drylands and November elegy. He follows these families and they are successful, some of them are not, because of course, as we experience today, there are droughts. There's the great dust storms that happen from farming. So there's the beginnings of some ghost towns and the development of some larger cities. And at the end, he's interviewing Mr. Garrett in this book, who happens to be a descendant from many of these established settlers for the area. and is now a member of the state administration. And he is tasked with the environment and natural resources. And he says, I thought the task was to provide the people of Colorado with good air to breathe. Now I've got to see that they have water to drink. And when the soil experts get through their indoctrination, I suspect my principal job will be to ensure that we have earth to till. This nation is running out of everything. We forgot the fact that we've always existed in a precarious balance. And now if we don't protect the components, we'll collapse. So it's a precarious balance. It's fantastic, but I encourage you all to read it. Thanks.
Questions or thoughts? Yeah, I don't think questions either. I love the maps too.
Yeah, that was great that they included them at the beginning of each chapter, really makes a difference.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. Let's see, who's next? Oh, Richard.
Should we invite Lindsay?
Pardon?
Lindsay.
So the Colorado Doctrine by David Shore. He's an interesting fellow. He's a lawyer and a historian, and he's a professor at Tel Aviv University. And he has studied property rights regimes and water rights in India, Brazil, Israel, and Colorado. And Yale University Press and Oxford picked it up and printed it. So his goal is to prove to us that distributed justice was more important in explaining our water rights regime than economics or wealth maximization or efficiency. And that's pretty much the theme of the book. Next slide. So this is his summary of the Colorado Doctrine. Again, his methodology is he goes back and finds newspaper articles and speeches from the 1870s through the 1890s. So it's a real effort to kind of dig in and find out what they were really thinking at the time versus this kind of first in time, first in right, that's all we need to know kind of thing. So he makes it more rich. So these are the three elements of the Colorado Doctrine. Public ownership of surface waters of the state, which of course means anybody who uses the water only has a beneficial use. We don't own the water, it belongs to the state. So the requirement of beneficial use by actual settlers, which is huge because it avoids monopolies and speculation and outside money. Got to be there using it. And complete rejection of riparian rights. They saw riparian rights as a way to concentrate water rights and then concentrate wealth so that the average man and a farmer couldn't access it unless they were really wealthy. So this is his core version. Next. He digs a little bit into history and philosophy to help prove his point about distributed justice. He says the best way to understand this is not interest-based politics, economics, or efficiency, which I mentioned earlier, but it's the ideas of John Locke, Thomas Jefferson, and Andrew Jackson. And they were highly popular in the mid-19th century. He quotes people from 1850 to 1880, picking up these ideas. What were these ideas? John Locke thought that the way to have rights in private property is to invest labor in that property. And so no one could acquire more property than he could make use of. And so he calls that radical Lockean. And then he cites Jefferson for the idea that we all have to have, there should be room for small family farms, so everybody can own a little bit of land and be independent and have limited rights to water for their farm, not more. And that if we have a society with small farmers, with small plots of land, that they'll support a kind of a wholesome democracy made up of independent people. And then, to a lesser extent, he cites the Jacksonian democracy idea that came from the 1830s, that we need to be support the common man and settling the frontier, give up this Eastern aristocracy stuff. And so water should be for actual use. And as you may know, Jackson was a big proponent of egalitarian common man kind of politics. So those are sort of the theoretical antecedents he thinks for how we got to the distributive justice that is reflected in our prior appropriation rules. Next. So he says that beneficial use is a neat idea that came out of balancing some tensions and how to allocate water. And he makes the point again and again that the idea of priority is pretty secondary, but the core idea is here that, you know, given all this common man stuff, we want to have equality in the availability of the regular. But if equality were carried to an extreme, it would mean that all the claimants would get water and it probably wouldn't be enough for everybody. You know, it would go below a point of diminishing returns and you wouldn't have enough water to irrigate your farm. So they counterbalanced equality with the idea of sufficiency. So that, of course, meant we can all get water, but it's limited by the fact that we each need sufficient water to irrigate our farm adequately. So he's saying that the blend of the equality idea with the sufficiency idea led to the idea of beneficial use. Those are the antecedents that made it happen that way. And so once you blended equality and sufficiency and get to beneficial use, you get to the idea of prioritization to balance equality and sufficiency. So I thought that was a pretty interesting explanation of how we got to beneficial use. Next slide. Thank you. So he's fond of beneficial use because it's tied to actual use by settlers versus Eastern money or European money or concentrating wealth. And so it had the effect, the beneficial use doctrine had the effect of being, you've heard this before, anti-monopolistic and anti-speculative. And it fits with the Jacksonian and populist beliefs that were very popular in the agrarian reform world in the 1850s to 1880s. Farmers fought to stop Eastern and European money from buying up all the water rights in the canal companies. And the legislature and the courts helped support this. So it's really kind of a moment of the confluence of courts, legislatures, and farmers all seeing the value of beneficial use and keeping out aggregates of wealth. Next. So here is his theme. Distributive justice is what is reflected in beneficial use. And what does he mean by it? The widespread distribution of the right to use, not own water. That's kind of the culmination of, in the West, of Jefferson, Jackson, and Locke. And so, this is the comment I just made. From the 70s to the 90s, you had this amazing confluence of political beliefs that gave priority to distributive justice over other ways that you could have allocated water. So he's saying a real economic choice was made for this distributive idea, whereas they could have said, let's go for high productivity, which would mean much more bigger ownership of land, larger plots of land, concentrating more water rights, or efficiency, which probably would be related to high productivity or wealth maximization. And he's saying that the courts, the farmers and legislature did not choose that. They went for a widespread use of water. So in political terms, you could call this an egalitarian policy, which Shore calls distributive justice. I have only one quote for you, which reflects these ideas. Contemporaries saw riparian rights as the tool of monopoly and oppression. The land interests and water rights are necessarily connected. If water rights are in the hands of irrigation companies and the land in the hands of individual farmers, the farmer will be at the mercy of stock companies, and monopoly will become a burden of the people. If we then permit a foreign rule of law, like riparian rights, to be applied to land tenure, that will foster greed, favor monopolies, and give to the few what nature intended for, and the law should give to all of us. We would permit an injustice to our people. So that's kind of an embodiment of his distributive justice idea. So I will attempt to take a question.
Philosophy put into the prior appropriation. Very
Can I just
interesting.
make a quick comment for her? I brought something to share last time and I totally forgot it and I know to pass around today. This is CSU's, I don't know, quarterly magazine, whatever that we share. But there's an article in here about spur, but there's also a really interesting article about the Colorado River. So anyway.
That's a brand, you know, when they did.
It's the one with him sitting in the dry riverbed. Yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
and Brad works for the Water Center.
Yeah.
Karen.
Yeah. Anyway. So you guys might want to look at that. But the Hydro Center is our new water center at the spur
That's
campus in Denver.
And if you're in Denver, Karen and I just did a little self-tour of those buildings. They're beautiful buildings. There's one for,
It's Vita, Terra, and Hydro. Vita is life, and it's primarily on medicine, is focused really on vet medicine and the transfer. But there's a Temple Grandin Equine Center there. You can watch them do surgery on dogs and cats.
they have windows there.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And then Terra is all about land and land use, and there's greenhouses and stuff. And then Hydro is all about water, and Denver Water is actually
They're half.
and they're on 2 or 3 floors in that building.
Yeah, but they're just interesting displays. You can take the kids because they're interactive too.
And I think anytime, whatever, 8 to 5, I don't know exactly
You can
that.
just
You
walk
can walk
in the
in,
building.
yeah, they're intended to be.
And
Public
there's things to look around, and we saw a horse being exercised, and it's just really interesting. My favorite, of course, is the cat. So if you go to the Vita building, approach the cat from the front and then approach the cat from the back.
So I had a question. You said a horse was being exercised?
Exercised in an arena there.
Okay.
And they get the demon out.
That's what I was.
I appreciate your support.
And actually, if you go to
Whoa.
they do equine therapy. It's the Temple Grandin Equine Center. They do
Got it.
equine therapy with vets and children with disabilities and that kind of stuff. So, yeah, it's cool. It's very cool.
All right, so let's go on to our next presenter. Thank you, book reports on time.
Yeah,
I think next
on the money.
we have 4 book reports.
We do have 4.
Yeah, so
But we have a little more time for it too.
Yeah, so we'll have a good book report session. Next we have here Lindsay Rogers, and Lindsay is from the Western Resource Advocates. Many of you in your comments throughout the session have talked about that land use planning component with water and water conservation. And he was involved, Western Water Resource Advocates were involved with the report that was put out, oh, it's been about 4 years ago. Yeah, and she was very instrumental in putting that report together. So I'm gonna let Lindsay talk to you. You can see her bio here. She's well qualified and I'm gonna step back and let her.
Nice meeting you. Here.
All the emailing.
I know. Hi, everyone. It's great to see you all, meet you all. Thanks for having me. I'm very excited that you're all participating in this course, and I was really excited to see today's agenda on municipal water uses, which is the focus of my work. So today I'm going to talk to you about some of the best practices and tools that our communities, particularly in northern Colorado, are using to sort of advance the field of integrated water demand management and land use planning efforts. All right, so if you're not familiar with our organization, Western Resource Advocates is an environmental nonprofit. We work in the Intermountain West, so the 7 states listed here, to protect our climate, land, air, and water. We typically do that by developing policy or exploring, advocating for policies at the state level, commissions. My work primarily is with local governments, at the local government level. And I'm on our Healthy Rivers team, so I really work to advance and focus on municipal water conservation and integrated planning, with the goal of both making our communities much more climate resilient and also reducing strain on our rivers and streams. So I'm going to start out today with a real quick sort of introduction and overview to this concept of integrated planning and define some of the terms, talk about some of the trends and kind of successes that we're starting to see in this space. Then I'm gonna dive into an overview of the various, or some of the various strategies that we have throughout the development process, like a spectrum of development and land use planning that you can use in your communities to integrate water into land use planning. And then I always think that examples and case studies resonate the most. So I'll focus on some of those projects that we've been involved in, or examples that I think are really successful in Colorado in the last few years. And I'll leave time for questions. I'm also happy to take questions throughout, so just jump in if anything comes up. So yeah, your agenda today, as I saw, is focused on municipal water use. So I thought it was appropriate to start out with my interpretation of why you might be focused on municipal water use today. This stat at the top is something that bothers me a little bit because I think sometimes it's used to undermine the importance of municipal water use. But Colorado, 7% of our water goes to the municipal, industrial, or municipal sector, actually, specifically. The rest of that is going to agriculture and the industrial sector. So it's relatively small, but we're facing a lot of challenges in the municipal sector. And I think that's why there's a lot of folks that are really focused on sort of addressing those issues. So this is from our Colorado Water Plan that projects by 2050, 360,000 acre year projected municipal and industrial supply and demand gap, which is quite a lot. So to put that in perspective, each one household uses about half an acre foot per year in Colorado. So this is the equivalent of about 720,000 households water use per year. So quite a large gap. It's primarily due to climate change. So Colorado Water Plan also estimates we'll be at about 7.5 million people in 2050, up from our current 5.8-ish, maybe we're approaching 6 million. And then that's coupled with climate change, prolonged drought, as we all know, exacerbating those supply challenges. So what that means is that this increased demand on limited supplies is leading to major price hikes that we expect will continue to go up. So Colorado Big Thompson project, CBT shares are sort of a measure that we use, especially in northern Colorado, to think about the price of new water. And right now they're hovering 93,000, they're approaching $100,000 per acre foot for one acre foot of CBT water. So quite expensive. And the other thing that happens when we have more demands on limited supplies, we can see our other water users impacted. So farmers, ranchers, affected by buy and dry water transactions. That's, a challenge we face in the Northern Front Range. And then certainly increased pressure on our rivers, which are supporting, lots of wildlife and species. All that to say that we're having a really good water year right now, as you know. Sort of makes this message a little more
It's
challenging.
just 1 year though.
It's 1
Yeah,
year.
1 year.
So my point being that, that one for a good year is not gonna be nearly enough to negate any of these long-term trends. We still need to keep pushing. So this is, I think, why, in the last decade or so, we're really seeing more of a shift from this traditional thinking of increasing our supplies, so supply side water management in our municipal sector towards demand side water management. And we're seeing more communities invest at scale in these types of solutions. So there's 3 main types of demand side water management strategies, and you're going to hear these terms, and a lot of people use these terms sort of interchangeably, at least the first 2. So water conservation is more of our, like what we would think of as our traditional water programming that communities offer. It's where we're encouraging, incentivizing water users to reduce their use. Our current community members typically. Water efficiency, this is where we're requiring, encouraging the use of technology, building or site design that uses less water. So often happens more throughout the development process. And then water reuse is where we're treating, converting gray and black water to replace or augment our supplies. And utilities both do that on a centralized scale where we've got, non-potable water systems, or now we actually just legalized in the state direct potable reuse systems. But this also refers to on-site reuse, so gray water systems, onto the landscape, that kind of thing. And the great trend that we're seeing, and I think and hope will continue in Colorado, is that when we actually invest at scale in those solutions, in that water conservation efficiency and reuse, we can begin to decouple our population growth from our water demand. So these are just a few statistics here in Fort Collins. The city's grown 6% from 2000 to 2015 and saw their total water use reduced by 14%. And that's total, that's not gallons per capita, that's their overall demand. Denver's got some similar stats, 17% growth. They saw 28% reductions over that same time period. And Colorado Springs, arguably the most impressive here, they grew 92%. They almost doubled since the mid-'80s, and the city's using the same amount of water today as it was 40 years ago. So all to say that there's real potential when you actually invest at scale in implementing these solutions. And I don't think any of this data suggests that we're reaching diminishing returns here in Colorado. Even our most efficient water utilities, they still, in their water efficiency plan say they're going to reduce by 20%, 25, 30% more in the coming years. So we have a lot of opportunity still.
And
Landscaping outside.
those trends are continuing beyond 2015?
The trends are continuing, and these were pulled from, Colorado Springs is self-reported, and this was the first 2 were pulled from a report, so that just happened to be published, I think, in 2017. But yeah, we're seeing the trends continuing. The other challenge that we're seeing with climate change is that our cities have more pressure and increased demand, like our landscaping is using more water. So these are all factors we'll have to pay attention to and see how they play out, but pretty good data to suggest that the trends will continue. Yeah.
What is that supply demand gap? How are they projecting the demand? If the trends are continuing to go down for water use, are they using like a static gallons per, person or something?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, that supply demand gap comes out of the technical update to the Colorado Water Plan, which was passed in 2019 or came out in 2019 and uses a variety of different scenario planning. And I think that's where they found sort of the median there. It is my personal opinion that they were overly conservative in the demand estimates. I would guess that if we really push, we can reduce our demand a lot more. So the idea being that in the water plan that we would sort of meet that demand gap, both with supply side and demand side management solutions. And I think we can get a lot more aggressive on the demand side.
It,
Can I answer your question?
it cascades over into other facilities like wastewater. And these
Yeah.
guys have heard this, but in Santa Fe, where I used to live in New Mexico, the treatment plant had typically, when it was upgraded, been designed for 12 to 15 million gallons a day. When we went through our most recent upgrade, we looked at the data and it said we designed it for, a 20-year life, 9.8 million
Wow,
gallons.
that's amazing.
So, and it actually causes more problems because you have to design for the lower flows as well as the higher flows.
Yeah.
And it doesn't work as well.
Yeah, it is interesting, especially in like, real tourism based.
And our water use the whole time I was there, kept going, the wastewater flow kept going down.
Yeah, yeah. We're definitely gonna see some of those changes over time, and I think that just really highlights the need for right sizing our infrastructure, which is critical in this land use planning conversation. Great. Okay, the last little sort of theme I wanted to highlight today, because I'm gonna talk about it a lot, is an emphasis around reducing our outdoor water use, which selfishly, that's a big focus of my work, which is why I'm going to talk about it a lot, but it's also a big focus of a lot of folks that work in the water conservation space. And the main reason why that is because nearly 50% of our municipal water supplies in Colorado are applied to our outdoor landscaping. And just, as we know from looking around, actually landscaping here looks really nice, but typically in office parks, you look around.
In the media, they've got the street, nobody's gonna have a picnic out there.
Yeah. Typically, even more so, they've got like some nice stormwater retention area here, but anyway. Lots of high water use grass, mostly Kentucky bluegrass. It's ubiquitous, across the West and has been for many, many years. And what's really challenging about that is our outdoor water use is consumptive. So the water that we apply outdoors, it's going to get used by the plant or it's going to evaporate, and hardly any of that is going to make it back into our system, like indoor water use, right? Where we then get it treated at our wastewater plant and we get to reuse it in some form or other. And that's why there's been a real emphasis, especially on this term, non-functional turf grass. Is that something that folks have heard used? Non-functional, non-essential. So it's our median strips, right? It's our tree lawns. It's grass in our office parks. It's maybe our front yards. Any grass where the only person that is interacting with it in any way is the person that's mowing it. Yeah.
Which adds to global warming, by the way.
Okay, more emissions, yeah, it all ties together. So it's a challenge, and it's not to be confused with our functional grass, like, right, our soccer fields and our picnic areas and maybe our backyards, which are very much serve a community value and purpose. But that's a real emphasis of the work that I do is on trying to figure out how we transition our landscapes in the coming years to move away from that high water use turf grass. And we'll talk about how we do that throughout the land use process. Okay, so why do we integrate water and land use planning? Historically, these two processes have been quite siloed. So our land use planners and our community development directors were responsible with figuring out the vision for the community, how and what and where we were going to grow. And then our water resource managers, public works directors, who may or may not be the same part of the same agency, right? So maybe a separate division, maybe they're a whole separate entity. They would say like, okay, I'm going to go out and figure out how to get enough supply to provide water for that new development. And, as you can imagine, we realized that led to a lot of inefficiencies and a lot of mixed opportunities throughout the development process. We also know that when we integrate water conservation throughout the land use planning process, not just in retrofits in our community or traditional conservation, we can significantly reduce our demand in new development and redevelopment. It's a lot cheaper than retrofitting, a lot faster too. This approach empowers communities to improve water efficiency within their own context, so it gives local control, and it says, you know, you decide what your values, what your aesthetics, what your cultural needs are, and determine which solutions make sense for your community. And it helps us align our water supply and demand to increase resiliency to drought and climate change. It was a kind of key objective that was identified in the 2015 Colorado Water Plan. So the state said that by 2025, 75% of Colorado should be living in communities that have incorporated water saving action into land use planning. And they've, you know, put a lot of resources, as many communities have in the last 8 years, towards achieving this goal. Organizations that we work with think that we're somewhere in the ballpark of 60 to 80%. So we've really made a lot of progress just in the last few years to really, really advance this field. All right. So now I'm going to talk about the different strategies and tools available to us at different intervention points along this development spectrum. So we start with planning and policy making, and this is where we set the goals and vision for our communities and figure out how they're going to influence our policy priorities for many, many years to come. It includes comprehensive plans, which guide how communities will manage future land use and its implications for lots of different community functions, including water, resource management. It also includes capital improvement plans where we can set our priorities for water infrastructure investment, and we can make sure that they are tracking our water demands, that they are climate resilient. You know, and then the last one here is water efficiency plans, which are a state requirement for water providers of a certain size, where we outline our goals for conservation. Yeah, go ahead.
What about good old county and municipal ordinances that make requirements for?
You're way ahead of me.
Oh,
Yeah, exactly. The plans help set those policy priorities for later adoption. Yeah, no problem. So anyway, same way that we can incorporate water into comp plans, we can incorporate land use planning tools, demand reduction tools into our water efficiency plans to help us meet those demand reduction goals. Which brings us to pre-development opportunities here. So this is where we really link new development to water supply planning. So we can use our water adequacy requirements, which help are also a state requirement, and they help local governments ensure that they have adequate, sufficient, sustainable water supplies for new developments that are coming online. And they are an opportunity to incentivize or require demand management tools in that pre-development step. And then similarly, we can use conservation-oriented tap fees or system development charges to financially incentivize water-wise development by tying our tap fees to the actual water use of that site more closely. And that brings us to the development review process. And this is how we determine what conservation efficiency requirements or incentives are required in new development. So we can do this through our zoning and subdivision regulations, and we can encourage efficiency by allowing for certain forms of new denser development typically. We can also do this through annexation and planned unit development applications. So cities and counties can say that those applications are conditional on meeting certain water standards. And then we can also provide process incentives. So we can say, okay, we're going to expedite this review process for you if you do certain water conservation things that we want to see in the community. Building and construction, here we go. So this is our ordinances, our plumbing code, our building code, our landscaping standards, you know, things like adopting a green building code or a gray water reuse ordinance, or requiring those water-wise landscape development best practices that can be quite impactful. And then the last phase here is post-occupancy. So this is where we get into a little bit more of what we traditionally think of conservation programming, where we set our rates to be tiered or based on water budgets to ensure that we are financially incentivizing lower water use. This is our traditional educational programs or conservation rebate programs or training opportunities. Summer watering restrictions are quite common across Colorado, as are water waste ordinances. And then it could be support for larger water users in auditing and providing water budgets to help them reduce use. Yeah.
Having used to work for a utility company, the whole issue around rate structure is really, it's a struggle from the utility perspective, because something like 85% of the cost of delivering you a gallon of water is in the pipes in the ground and the plants that treat it. It's not in the water itself. So if you
Yeah.
make the rate heavily tiered towards how much you use, you can end up, it's not a balanced equation then, because you still have to recover that 85% to pay for the pipes in the ground. And so everybody whines that, hey, we conserve, and they keep raising the rates, and that's the explanation. But
Yeah.
so you do that politically to get people to conserve water, but then realize that's just gonna mean that their rates are gonna go up. They need a certain amount. Really, what they say is like 85% of your bill should be a fixed charge and 15% should be in the water. That would be a true cost of service, but it wouldn't encourage conservation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right, and you hit it spot on, that the argument that you hear, especially if you're in an elected or appointed local water position, is that, why are you gonna raise my rates? Why am I gonna pay more for using less water, which is really tough to sort of figure out how to come up with an argument against. But you're right in that what we're seeing over time is that folks, utilities are raising those baseline rates, so that consistent fee that everybody is paying per month, because really most of the costs are in the treatment, the transportation, the water, no matter what you're using. And then they're, I think, doing a somewhat successful job of figuring out how to explain to community members, and there was a really great study out of Westminster, and maybe 2015 now, so a few years ago. But basically, if they're not investing in these demand management tools, if they were going out and providing more supply, your rates would be a lot higher than they are. So even though they're going up less. It's not what we want to hear, but
Yeah, I totally get that, yeah.
One way it's disguised on the non-pot side of things is, there's a modest fee that the builder pays to the town, but the system is owned by the HOA.
Yeah.
And your taxes pay for that. So it's like a mortgage. It's like a 30-year payment
Right.
that's built into that piece of land. It's disguised because you don't see a down payment on the water system. It's
Right.
all pay as you go. And then the operation cost, the dollars per gallon, there's still a fixed cost in that, which is kind of like the admin or the overhead cost. So and we're struggling with that.
Okay.
A metro board that does the non-pot. And there it's like, well, we've got a flat rate that's too high, that doesn't encourage conservation.
Right.
But yet we need to get enough money in to be able to take care of business.
Right.
And there is a fixed cost there. So, yeah, we're banging our heads on.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Another thing I've heard from utilities with non-potable in particular is that they are often subsidizing non-potable water because they want to encourage that water use, the right water in the right place at the right time. And so it's another kind of financing headache.
Kermit the Frog said it best, it ain't easy being great.
That's true, but it's worth it. I think so. I hear number here first.
Yeah, so I work for her, we design and develop a lot of non-pot systems.
Cool.
Jeannie's funded one of them for us.
Oh, great.
Could you clarify your comment a moment ago about being subsidized? Because I don't think we've had that experience.
Okay.
Let's bridge things up real quick. Yeah, and I know that we get a lower tap fee if we do timber use only, but I think that's a little different than maybe what you were interested in.
Yeah, I don't really know enough to speak to this. This is something that I've heard, and I don't want to throw any municipal partners under the bus for this. But what I've heard is that maybe the cities are not recouping their full costs of the non-potable systems, given that it is a large infrastructure investment, or they're subsidizing the rate structure. Maybe they got their upfront cost back, but they're subsidizing that rate structure to make it more tenable compared to potable water use and encourage more use of non-potable and more tie-ins.
Okay,
But it's really gonna be city by city.
Not to take away from, it, but in the smaller communities, when non-pop was brought in, because we deal with that in the smaller ones that we mentioned. They brought in the non-pot and the towns hadn't planned on how to do the operation and maintenance of it. And everything is the old school before meters was just tap. And you're actually finding the communities are overusing the non-pot by running them 24/7 because they can.
Mhm.
That's where they're finding out there's not a way to maintain it. So that's where some of the subsidies for older subdivisions, when it was new, was just bringing it in, and now they're behind and having to redo their rate structures that are gonna be astronomical. Frustrate folks because wells are now needing repairs and infrastructure, so that's kind of, versus nowadays, I think it's less problematic because
Yeah, maybe.
they're on top of it, so.
we're moving away from meters. I know that's like a terrible thing to say, but when you're developing 2,000 units, it's gonna be owned and maintained by the metro district, so there's zero government involvement. And the tap runs at a 5-foot easement down the rear fence line. It's really non-operationally executable to have one person have to go read every meter, replace the battery on every meter, be in every single person's yard in the community.
For non-potable.
But those are for communities that have a metro. There's some communities that don't allow, but I agree, if you can master meter it, there's an HOA forever, I agree.
Yeah, that's how we're structuring them.
Yep.
Yeah, and that's what we did in Evans with, some homestead, as you know, and plan to do with the 500 unit agreement. But yeah, I agree. We haven't seen a lot of incentives from
Okay.
the municipalities.
Really, just what their goals to encourage more.
Although I admit, I used to live in a home that had unlimited non-pot 45 years ago, because there was a gravel pits out behind, and it had originally been a trailer park that they made into a neighborhood, and everybody had a old tap from when it was a trailer park. And you irrigated like crazy because you didn't care. There's no consequence to having a really
Yeah,
beautiful garden.
well, that's why this master having the HOA kind of control the design and then the eventual water use is very beneficial. So
And then there's an enforcement mechanism that's
Yeah, yeah, I think
non-jurisdictional, it's
that's
just
what
the
helps.
district.
So,
Yeah.
for the landowners that have unlimited because they're next to an irrigation bit, I mean, I know people, so, how are the municipalities kind of, wanting to send that message to those landowners
Yeah.
to conserve?
Maybe they have their own wells or their own raw
You're
ditch
still
water rights.
paying, you're still paying for the water, you're just paying much more reduced rate.
Yeah.
And it's not like you're getting huge breaks. I mean, it's still very much to the benefit of the landowner to be water wise. Yeah. Because there isn't unlimited water.
Right.
There's no.
But not everybody sees
I
that.
was
For
gonna
those
say,
of us who,
yeah.
I was fresh out of Alabama and to grow tomatoes in Colorado, you gotta get a lot of water.
Maybe to answer your question right now, and I think we're making a distinction here between non-potable systems, which are still owned and operated by the utility, and then these raw ditch water rights, which they aren't within the jurisdiction of these providers. So I worked on a project in the Roaring Fork Valley recently, and they wanted to do unified summer watering restrictions amongst all their jurisdictions. And one of the big issues that was raised is that we've got all these landowners who have their own raw ditch water rights, and we can't tell them that they have to abide by 3-day-a-week watering. And so really the only mechanism that they have, I think, that we kind of identified was education and sort of recognition. Let's get everybody on the same page.
When I was a consultant, one of our crazy ideas was to have hourly billing. We get a kick out of that, just bill them every hour, send out a bill.
Yeah.
But, it's like the pay toilet, put a water ring, you'll get, you'll be able to water your grass for the afternoon.
Right.
Or $5 maybe.
Yeah, I haven't seen that, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's somewhere, at least beginning of.
Well, the utility, we get hourly data now. I can tell you what my buildings are using hour by hour.
But
For- with
our
advanced
metro
meter.
district has
Yeah.
automatic metering.
Yeah.
So they'll know if you're screwing up, if you're on.
But you don't know, it turns out you don't know till tomorrow. It's not quite real time.
Right, right. Another really important conservation strategy, we're not gonna get into this too much today, but AMI, advanced meters, we're seeing that come online much more commonly in Colorado in the last few years. And this is real-time water loss information that you can have on the customer side for them to identify leaks and, reduce their usage. So,
They're awesome for identifying leaks. When you have a building that goes from a few hundred gallons a day to 6,000 gallons a day, you start poking
yeah.
around.
Okay,
Let me up with that. I know some horror stories from family members just recently in Lovelands, like almost downtown Lovelands last year, and it's like $3,000 later of water bills. So it's like over 300 gallons.
And did they have a leak or was it some kind of
Yeah.
administrative?
Yeah, and
Oh.
didn't catch it and didn't know.
And sometimes the utility will work with you if you've got that kind of devastating financial impact.
Where are we at in implementing those?
AMI meters, actually, the utility will call, CSU's master meter, so that's not true within our big campus, but like one of our buildings off campus, they said, we noticed that this building has not gone to zero in a week, because most buildings go to zero at some point in hourly rate.
Right.
And it looks like it's using 10 times more. We went over there was a frozen pipe in a flooded basement in a building we don't look at very often.
Yeah.
And so there is that, but you have to have a utility that pays
And
attention.
to answer your question, utilities are all across the spectrum of adopting that technology. We're certainly not all on the line with
So
those
I'm
systems.
gonna cut off.
Oh,
Make sure that Lindsay.
But I
has
would
one.
love, it's really
Yes,
great.
for
I'm so
her.
excited.
What does?
I'm excited that everybody
That's
has.
why it's plastic so.
I know. This is gonna be my typical presentation. Oh, but I feel like everyone's dead silent. It's very awkward. So, okay. Going. Hopefully we'll have more time for questions. I'll try to get through the rest of the slides quickly. So, again, the case study is more helpful, I think, than all of this information. So I'm gonna take these ones in bold and walk through a few different examples from communities. So we had the opportunity to work with the town of Severance. Anyone from Severance here? No, really, you guys all know where Severance is, fast growing community. At the time we were working on this, they're the fastest growing by percentage in the state of Colorado. I think they're up around 10,000 right now. And we got to start working with them on their comprehensive plan right at the time when HB 2010-95 was adopted, which is a state statute that says if you're gonna include a water element in your comprehensive plan, which is best practice, you need to include water conservation, demand management, Colorado Water Plan objectives in that water plan. And so we were brought in to help them make that happen. We worked with, their land use planners, their public works directors, planning commission electeds, a number of community meetings. And what they ended up doing was developing discrete water system and utilities chapters that really outlined both their water supply and demand projections and infrastructure. And then they identified specific policies and strategies for securing new supplies and demand reduction. And they integrated those water conservation elements throughout the entire plan. So in their guiding principles and their future land use planning map and their different zoning categories. It was really sort of integrated throughout. And this is just a line that I really like from the plan that they ended up adopting, which is that any proposal for changing land uses in and around Severance will be evaluated based on water resource availability and commitment to water efficient development practices, which I think just really sets the tone for them as they take the plan and move into adopting it into policy for what they want to see in their community. And I think this is a success because we've kept in touch with the town and seen how their progress is going, and they've already adopted new multifamily regulations that reduce encourage require water-wise landscaping. We, encourage more dense development, and now they're moving on to commercial development and open space standards. So they're implementing the plan. But the next opportunity I wanted to talk about a little bit is around conservation-oriented tap fees. So this is a guide that is sort of a project that WRA has been working on for a while. And we put out a guide in 2018 with a bunch of different examples. So traditionally, our tap fees or our water system development charges have been based on meter size. You've got a 5/8, 3/4 inch meter, doesn't really matter how big the house is, how big the lot is, it's gonna be, you're gonna pay the same amount for your water resources and for your planned investment fee or whatever you kind of pieces of that fee structure. But conservation oriented tap fees, which more and more communities, actually quite a lot of communities have moved in this direction in the last 5 or 10 years. This means that you're basing fees on lot size, on landscapable area, on the number of bedrooms or bathrooms in that house, or some other sort of water use factors. And you're trying to get at how much water is that property actually going to use. And if you do it really well, you then tie this to a water budget. So you say, now I actually know how much water the property used and it's within what we thought they were gonna use.
We're really careful about lot size when, 59.95, like we nail that as we go down the block because of this reason.
Yeah, exactly. It's interesting. So this is just an example, Little Thompson Water District took that approach. They serve about 8,000 residential customers in northern Colorado. And in 2016, they realized they were seeing a lot of denser, like more urban style development coming online. So they created what they refer to as their urban tap size, where they basically cut in half your water dedication and they significantly reduced the plan investment fee. But the kicker is they said that, okay, you're gonna elect for that urban tap size. Once you live in that home, you actually have to stay within your budget of 114,000 gallons per year. And if you don't, we're gonna penalize you. So we're gonna charge you more once you hit that max. So more momentum in this direction, I think, in the coming years. And we come to zoning codes. So zoning codes are how our communities figure out what we can build and where. So commercial, mixed use, single family, multifamily, those sorts of different development. And when I first think of zoning codes, I typically don't think of water initially. I think of like affordability and transit corridors and those kind of issues. But actually, it's one of the most impactful tools that we have to reduce demand in new development, because this compact and infill form of development is way less water intensive than single family development. And that's mainly because we're reducing our landscaping so much per unit. So this is just some data from the Keystone Policy Center that came out with a 2018 report. And it was based on a sample from Denver and Aurora homes and housing units. And they found that compared to a single family use home, accessory dwelling units use 22% less water. Small multifamily, like our duplex to sort of small apartment building, uses 63% less water. And then our large traditional apartments use 86% less water. So very locally specific, may not make sense for the entire community, but moving in the direction of more dense zoning districts is like, one of our best water management tools. This next strategy is around landscape regulations. I said we'd talk a lot about landscaping, and this has gotten some news lately. That's because Castle Rock and Aurora, just in the last 6 months, they moved to significantly limit the installation of new non-functional turf grass. So, arguably those are the strongest standards we have on the books now in Colorado when it comes to landscape regulations. So just to use Castle Rock as an example, they said that you can no longer have any lawns in your front yards. You guys might know that Castle Rock is really, really water strapped. So they have a serious water supply challenge. And then they also said that you're limited to 500 square feet in your backyard. So sort of recognizing this functional versus non-functional issue.
This is for new development, the existing
Yes.
don't have to convert, okay.
Really interesting question though, because it is focused on new development, but every city has the opportunity to define how their ordinances will impact redevelopment. And in the case of Castle Rock, it's fairly stringent. I don't know it offhand, but it's something like if you have like 20% of the site disturbed, you have to now come into compliance with the codes. So it's an issue, especially for communities that maybe aren't seeing a lot of new greenfield development, but are growing like denser and seeing a lot of redevelopment. That trigger point is really important. They also have standards around applying soil amendments and mulch that help retain water in the soil. lots and lots of irrigation efficiency best practices in their codes, or rotors and smart irrigation controllers and all of those tools. And then something that's also unique to Castle Rock, fairly unique in Colorado, is that they actually require their landscape and irrigation professionals who are going to sign off on these landscape and irrigation plans for new development to be certified and licensed in Castle Rock through the Qualified Water Efficient Landscaper Program. And, you know, landscape and irrigation professionals, unlike other skilled trades like plumbers, like our electricians, they don't have any kind of state licensure in Colorado right now. So right now it's up to local cities to decide if they're going to encourage or require any kind of certification to basically ensure that the folks that are installing these landscapes can comply with their code, right? Which can be quite technical.
Yeah, Northern Water is doing that.
Offering trainings.
Yeah.
Yes.
The certification, they're definitely advocates of that.
Definitely. They
Yeah.
offer a lot of
It's
different
interesting.
certifications.
I didn't realize that it was pretty much just moving across the board.
Yeah.
A lot more people.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so then the last opportunity I want to talk about is the flip side of those landscape codes. So our landscape codes help ensure that we are installing water-wise landscape in new development. It's the most cost-effective strategy. But on the flip side, we've got a lot of turf already in our communities. So one really important conservation program that our cities are adopting are turf replacements with landscape conversion projects. And we've just done some research on sort of the state of turf replacement in Colorado. And there's currently 29 cities and water providers that will offer turf replacement incentives this coming summer. 8 of those are here in northern Colorado, and I wrote them down. You guys probably know. Greeley, Fort Collins, Longmont, Northern Water, Berthoud, Evans, Frederick, and Loveland Water and Power. Did I miss anyone? Okay.
And that includes residential and commercial.
They include residential and commercial projects. So some programs like Northern Water are focused on larger property conversions, like native grass conversions, and then others are focused more on residential properties. Typically, these rebates are in the ballpark of $1 to $2 per square foot. So depending on whether you're DIYing the project or you're using a contractor, the cost could vary a lot. It's probably not going to cover your full cost, but it's, you know, helpful. And the programs save about 1 to 2 acre foot per acre per year. So it's scaled up, accelerated, you know, they have the potential to be a really significant tool. Anyone heard of Resource Central, Garden in a Box?
Yeah, question.
Of them.
Oh, yeah.
Scott had an actual
I
question.
was just wondering, do you know if they deed restrict the property so that future owners
Great
know
question.
they can come in and redo what they just.
Yeah, this has been an issue that's come up a lot. We worked on this piece of legislation. I was gonna mention it, and that was raised a lot. Obviously, we don't want cities and the state to make these investments in landscaping that then go away. To my knowledge, there aren't any cities at this time that are using any deed restrictions or tools in Colorado. They do use that tool in Southern Nevada, Southern Nevada Water Agency, and that's been raised recently in the state of Utah. So it could be coming. The thing is that we haven't actually seen that be a problem yet. There's been research over these like longer standing turf replacement projects, and typically they don't get changed back to turf.
Who wants to mow anyway?
Who wants to mow, who wants to have higher water bills? It seems like once they make this transition, even when the property changes, for the most part, they don't change back. But I wouldn't be surprised if we see that happen more over time. Anyway, Resource Central works with many of these 29 providers to help offer their programs. They offer Garden in a Box and turf removal, and they're a Boulder-based nonprofit. HB 221151 created the first statewide turf replacement program fund here in Colorado. So it's got a $2 million initial appropriation. The applications actually just closed in March for the first round. And, you know, I'm cautiously optimistic there's going to be lots and lots of interest in that program. So now what WRA is doing is figuring out how we get more money into that fund and kind of continue the momentum. The other really exciting advancement in the turf replacement world is that last year, a bunch of cities and water providers came together and they adopted a Colorado River Basin MOU. And they committed to different water conservation actions, one of them being to introduce a program to reduce the quantity of non-functional turf grass by 30% in their communities. So Denver, Aurora, Pueblo. Someone else.
Colorado Springs.
Colorado Springs, thank you. We all signed on to that MOU, and there's an opportunity for more cities to sign on and commit to this, but I think that is gonna lead to a lot of change in the coming years. So the last thing I'll just leave you with is, this is a lot of information, and for those that have an interest in this sector, this integrated planning space, I wanted to recommend the Growing Water Smart program. So the image on the right is actually the workbook, the guidebook for the program, which is, it's available publicly online, and it covers a lot of the topics, but a lot more than I went into today. Has anyone ever done Growing Water Smart? Nice. What'd you think?
It's good. I've done it with Platteville and
Cool.
Hudson was just awarded. So like you say,
Okay.
there's 5 or 6, 7 communities every year
We
that
will see
we're
each other
selected.
in May.
Will be
Yeah.
up there.
Cool, and Estes. So, this is a program that was, sort of designed and developed by the Babbitt Center for Land and Water Policy at the Sonoran Institute in 2017, and February's been involved in it from the start, and we actually just launched Growing Water Smart in Utah, which has been a fun and interesting challenge. But it's, the program is a 3-day workshop. You bring together a community team of 5 to 7 planners and water managers and electeds, all the people that make up your decision-making folks when it comes to integrated planning. And then you come out of the workshop with a 12-month action plan for how you're going to integrate your water into land use planning. And you're offered and have the ability to apply for follow-up technical assistance. So little plug for the resource and the training if you haven't heard of it or if it's of interest. And I will stop there and maybe over time, but I am more than happy to answer any questions that you have, and you can always reach out to me via email if you want access to more resources or if anything struck a note that we talked about today.
Can I plug a couple of communities doing really good things?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, shout out to Scott. So one of the things Windsor requires is if you have native, historic, raw irrigation water, you're required to do a non-potable irrigation system in your community. So ergo, that's the thing at Windsor, in a lot of places, it's great. And then Johnstown, I don't think they're here today, but Johnstown, if you do it's in our community there, it's all potable water, but if you establish native irrigation and then physically disconnect the irrigation system from the potable tap, the code says to tear it out. And we said, what if we physically disconnect it so we're not ripping up the soil? Then after establishment, whatever acre footage was dedicated to serve the native area is actually credited back to you in a water bank. So we are phasing our development there so that we do these big takedowns of native, and we actually get credited back and lower actual new raw water dedication later
Really cool.
as we move through the project, and we're trying to come up with 0 at the end, or, very little is left on the table. And then just a couple wishes from the developer side, writing water, non-potable standards that acknowledge the use of native landscape is really significant for us. So that's not just a blanket acre foot per acre requirement, but that it's tailored to the type of landscape, knowing that native eventually gets pulled off and doesn't need a permanent dedication. And then process wise, there are some jurisdictions that I think might require a new landscape plan amendment if you're gonna take the turf back out and make it really easy for the master developer to get rid of the turf. Don't make it hard to do the right thing.
That's great. And that reminds me that there's actually a bill moving through the legislature right now that we've been working on that sort of strengthens and clarifies existing language around HOA authority. And it basically says that HOAs need to, not limit us from installing water-wise landscapes or requiring turf grass. And it requires them to provide some sort of pre-submittal designs that folks can choose from. So that's an issue that we hear raised sometimes that hopefully is going to be addressed this year.
Well, let's take one through.
Great talking to you all.
Take a 15-minute break.
Yeah, that was.
Good. I just can't.
This is the. Next year, let's just start.
We were,
So we.
Going job, we had to go house and we never. So then it's fine.
No, I haven't. Yeah. It needs to be a different. Right.
Still part of. Started getting well. That's exactly what Sherry and Rob Bobby told me. Especially for me.
I do like the, I think that that's a pretty easy real time way of showing something how much they're spending.
In helping them to understand. We can do it, but it's. Even treating them as is. If it's helpful. Yes.
Proceed.
I get it. Next Friday. So you guys need to more. But you did though, did you? So you're talking about raising people's. That's good.
Well, yeah, you can imagine that could go there.
It's like,
And when you start, yeah, I start just kind of enjoying. Yeah. And the other. And so there's a certain. You have to start, yeah. Like, you know, all things say that was, and so that's. Good at. It's all.
Say, Benson, nice to meet you. Yeah, great to see you in person. I downloaded it, so here we go. If it doesn't, if it's a type of thing, then we can figure it out. Nice. No, I'm not involved, but so I gotta look a little bit more about that. Yeah, yeah. Should be.
And they go, oh,
That's not new, it's the whole other thing.
So. Yeah. And so I'm the government.
Yeah.
The ratio.
Great, yes, yes, I can do that. Okay. Gotcha.
So we can, there is a company that's next to us, we're almost in the middle of it. We did one of those stuff to that.
So I'm just trying to be a very. And so I probably have to actually do this time, he's got a partner. Okay. Still will. It's not falling only in this.
And they should, and I can still get to there as well. I always think of you after. And I know that I think we have more than three extras. Yeah. Feeling very overcome. Based on just like the water conservation conversation.
This was here, small businesses. It's under there for years. And it's, yeah, I think it's something. Otherwise.
Just checking in, this topic. I'm there. Just checking the heck, everything okay? Yeah, tell me if this is right. Okay, just looking at the presentation, you just awesome. Great. We have a slip. Solve it, click it. And so we'll have the, you kind of sit this right here, and we get a conversation. We're gonna go one at a time. Just the last everybody's paid, everybody might just not figure it out. And that's great, great, yeah, they're not copying on our topic. Go in your conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. We didn't. The other. I'm not gonna water about it. I want to get this thing. Yeah. There's no. Yeah.
So, learned a little bit about land use planning connected with water. We're gonna kind of dive into municipal planning and organizations with water supply. And we have here with us today, Shane Taylor, who is the town manager for Windsor. Helen, who is water resources manager for Loveland. And Mariel Miller, who is the water conservation manager for the city of Fort Collins. We're gonna give them, we told them they have 10 minutes. That's not a lot of time. But we also told them that we have 20 minutes scheduled for questions and interaction. So we'll see how that goes, because as always, they encourage you to ask questions as we go along. So we'll see where that takes us. And let's see, Todd, you gonna go first?
I certainly can.
I think we're gonna have Mariel go first.
In the order.
We should get started.
So I'm Mariel Miller, the Water Conservation Manager for Fort Collins Utilities. And I'm going to focus mostly on demand management, or what we think of as water efficiency conservation, and looking for alternative supply options. Jen Dial, the Water Resources Manager, is here to talk more about Fort Collins Utilities water supply. And that talk is happening after lunch. So I'll just very briefly touch on supply enough to give you some context for the demand side. So quick overview of our water service and our water service area. We provide water to about 70% of the city of Fort Collins. So there are other service providers that presents challenges and I think also a lot of opportunities for regionalism as well. You know, we have about 36,000 accounts, commercial, residential accounts, outdoor irrigation only accounts. So there's a large mix of different customer types that we're interacting with and helping manage their water use. In a year, we typically treat about 8 billion gallons. That's about 22 million gallons per day. Oh, and we also have award tasting water, which is like, yay, yeah, right, which I think we just got beat out by a Boston utility this last year, but yes, I know.
Wet in the water.
This is why we have so many, you know, great water dependent industries like breweries that are within the city. Uh-oh. There we go, thank you.
There we go.
Okay, so my supply talk, again, as I mentioned, is gonna be very brief. We have two sources of supply. One is our Cache-la-Poudre River system. That's mostly eastern slope water. And then we have our Colorado Big Thompson water, which is stored in Horseshoe Reservoir, managed by Northern Water. And that's part of our CB2 system. And that's Colorado River water. So that's mostly west slope water. We use about each of those sources 50-50 in a given year, and it's really great to have redundancy, but we also need both. We couldn't provide all of our demands that we have from customers on just one source or the other. But when one source is low, we can rely a little bit more heavily on the other source, or if one has poor water quality for a period of time, we can switch over to the other source. So there's some flexibility there that's really nice for us to have, but it doesn't solve all of our challenges. Our two supply challenges, as I see them, Jem may present something hopefully similar, but probably in much greater detail, are climate impacts. And we have really good water rights on our Poudre River system, but we are short on storage. And those two challenges really go hand in hand, because if we have less snowpack, which is where we get our water from, we're not reliant or using groundwater sources. It's all based on snowpack. If we have less snowpack in a period of years, and we know that the weather does fluctuate quite a bit, in years when we have greater snowpack, having more storage capacity and capability would allow us to save that water, almost as a savings account for us to use, in a year when we have lesser snowpack. There's also the complexity of the Colorado River issues. Given that Horsetooth or CBT is half of our water supply, we haven't seen direct impacts from that yet, but we're constantly watching that issue and are trying to be prepared as much as we can for what may or may not. Those discussions that are happening at a much larger scale at the federal level. So a little bit about what we do. I'm now kind of segueing to the demand side. Our team are 7 professionals who have very diverse skill sets and backgrounds who help manage water demands. So again, that's looking at creating, implementing and evaluating water conservation efficiency programs, plans, policies, a whole kind of slew of opportunities and approaches for us to take there. Given that we have so many different customer types and there's both indoor and outdoor water for those customers, it's really important that we have a lot of options for us to help customers reduce their water use. We started our conservation program back in 1977. We've really grown that to include over 16 programs that support the gamut of customer types that have measurable savings. We do a lot of additional things that don't have measurable savings, but are equally valuable, such as education and other different support tools and services that we offer. But what we're realizing is that that's really been our bread and butter for decades now, is incentives and programs and voluntary opportunities. And what we're seeing is that depending on what our supply looks like and where we want to go with future water use and demands, we may need to think a little bit more broadly and start to look at maybe development codes and some other areas in which we might be able to influence how water is used in our community. Mind? You're just gonna have to be on for me for a minute, if you don't mind, thank you. So you guys are a little bit of my guinea pig in showing these graphs for the first time. They're about 85–90% baked, but we're about 2 weeks away from issuing our 2022 annual report. So if you see some weird things here, that's probably why. But I'm gonna start with the graph on the left. That's a water use graph, starting with January on the x-axis on the far left, moving through the year. And you can see this very kind of iconic bell-shaped curve that a lot of water professionals are familiar with if you are dealing with water in the West at all. And that's because, I guess, irrigation. Yeah. You guys have learned a lot already. So what you're seeing there is residential in the blue and commercial in the orange. And you know, you're seeing the 2022 trend line, the 3-year average trend line. And this was really interesting for us because we evaluated this in relation to precipitation. And what we saw was that it was hotter and drier in 2022, where you're seeing more use than the 3-year average, and it was cooler, or excuse me, it wasn't cooler, but it was wetter. We got more moisture in that period of time where we're usually getting a lot less in July and August of last year. And so you can see how much that graph shifted in 2022 compared to the 3-year average. And it's really hard to say, you know, whether there's a strong correlation there, but it looks very indicative of what we would see and what we've seen in the past related to weather. So weather is a huge component, especially to outdoor use. I also want to mention that outdoor use is about 43% of our annual use. So large portion. There's a graph up there that shows a breakdown of commercial, indoor, outdoor. It also shows total residential. There's a pie chart that comes out that splits that up into more detail related to indoor, outdoor, and multifamily versus single family duplex water use. The graph on the bottom shows what we've been tracking for our water conservation program effectiveness. So those 16 programs that have measurable water savings, we are estimating those each year, and you can see we've been building up. We saw a dip in 2020 due to the pandemic. We saw a lot of participation in our programs drop off that year for understandable reasons. And we've been building back up. So in 2022, we saved an estimated 173 million gallons from water conservation programs. But to put that in context, that's only 2% of our total treated demands. Very small portion. It's a very important portion, but it's a very small portion. Granted, there's a lot of conservation and efficiency work happening that we're not measuring, some of which may or may not be influenced by the work that we do. So that's another thing to keep in mind. Slide.
Is there some city comparable size that is a model or sets a goal that we could learn from?
Yeah, there's a lot of communities along the Front Range. What's difficult is that their population size or the makeup of their customers are different. It's just all very nuanced. So it's hard to find an apples to apples comparison, but we are frequently monitoring. I'm going to get into some other metrics that are a little bit easier for us to monitor and value and compare to. So yeah, definitely using some communities as benchmarks for ourselves.
And Richard, you know, we probably distort her numbers. I'm Colorado State University. I'm one customer on her list and I use, I don't know, 5% of the water in the city, probably. Yeah.
Does anybody get 4%?
For
Versus
program
2%?
savings? You know, not that I can think of off the top of my head. I'm probably less familiar with the program water savings percentages, and those are even harder to benchmark against other communities because the way in which people are measuring those estimates and the types of programs they have, it just becomes really tricky. And so you have to be careful about what you're comparing yourself to and make sure you're doing that in an important way. Okay, this slide is another way we measure our demand. So this is the community gallons per capita per day, and population is what that graph's showing. Gallons per capita per day is our total treated water, the water that leaves our treatment plant. So it's being used for commercial and residential, divided by our total service area population. So that's less than the whole city, right? and then divided by the number of days in the year. And so you can see we've made progress over the years. From 2000, we've reduced it by 34%. From 2001, we were at 198 gallons per capita per day. In 2021, we were at 139 gallons per capita per day. And the spoiler alert, because again, these graphics are getting updated. In 2022, we were exactly the same as 2021. So again, 139 gallons per capita per day. And to meet our current goal, which is 130 gallons per capita per day by 2030, that's in our water efficiency plan, which is a council adopted plan. We should have been at the target of 138 gallons per capita per day in 2022. Our 5-year average for that GPCD is at 138 right now. And of course, that's going to change depending on what things, how things progress as we go forward. But what we're seeing is it's getting harder to make a difference in that GPCD number, especially with the impacts of climate change. So, I think I covered all those points. Next slide.
I have a dumb question. When you do gallons per capita per day, there's people that live in there. So like all the people that come and go from CSU that don't live in Fort Collins don't go into the denominator.
They do, but we take a portion of them.
Okay. All right.
There's a lot of estimating that happens with some of those transient populations.
Okay.
All right, so on to, I think this is my second to last slide, and I'll wrap it up. I wanted to touch on some of these demand challenges. This is not a comprehensive list, which is what makes my job so fun, and so rewarding and engaging, because there are a lot of challenges. Growth is a factor. It's not as big as a factor as it is for our water provider friends to the north and to the south of us, where there's more growth happening. We're fairly built out. The growth we're going to see is redevelopment that's probably going to be higher density. That's a lesser concern. It's the less dense developments that are higher water users, primarily because of the landscape area. Or if there was another big industrial or commercial water user that were to move into our service area, that could cause an impact as well. Water right limitations, especially related to CDT water rights, really limit our ability to do reuse and gray water in certain applications, and that could be a potential solution to demand management in the future. But right now, legally, we're coming hamstrung on opportunity. Leaks in our distribution system, we do a water loss audit. It's not auditing leaks beyond an individual's meter. It's auditing our own leaks within our own distribution system. And we are actually better than the national average, but you guys are probably, your jaws are going to drop when you hear how much water gets leaked through our 500 miles of water mains. It's 10% of our treated use. So it's a massive amount. If there's opportunities to invest in capital improvement projects to take care of some of those older water mains, we probably would be pretty well served. Those are really expensive projects and complex projects, but so it's not like there isn't a trade-off there.
What's the Colorado or national average?
I want to say the national average is closer to 15%.
I think that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, this next one is outdoor opportunities. As I mentioned, 43% of our water use gets applied outside. There's a big opportunity there. But there's also a lot of challenges to that. There's knowledge for industry professionals, so those in the landscape and irrigation business. These are new types of landscapes, considering for the last few decades, we've all been installing turf grass. They know how to do that really well. Some of these other landscapes are a bit more challenging. The aesthetic component, a lot of people are used to seeing green turf grass, and it takes time to evolve what you think looks good or what others think look good to transition more to a regionally adapted landscape instead of your traditional turf grass. And then trees. Trees have so many benefits. They also require water. And as we see landscapes convert to water-wise, drought-tolerant, xeriscape type landscapes, oftentimes the irrigation for those trees are not being considered. Those trees need to be on separate irrigation systems. They need to continue to be watered, even if you're going to, maybe not water your turf grass as much as you did before. That tree might be somewhat dependent on that level of water it was getting before when it was underneath a big turf landscape. So there's lots of things to consider there. We want to maintain our urban canopy. And then behavior. You can install your irrigation system correctly, you can have all the right plants that are regionally adaptive or native or water-wise, whatever it might be, that infrastructure can be there. If it's not managed and operated correctly, you're not gonna see any water savings, or the water savings will be greatly diminished from what the full potential might be. Low-hanging fruit. We feel like we've picked a lot of the low-hanging fruit over the last few decades of our efforts. There's probably still more we can do, and I'm gonna get into my last slide here in just a second that explains how we're trying to evaluate some of those things, but it gets harder as you have to do harder things. The water use savings starts tapering off, you don't continue to see that big, decline in your gallons per capita per day, or incline in your savings from your program work. So, it's, I think, the nature of a lot of things, like trying to, lose weight and plateau. It gets harder as you get closer to the finish line. And so part of that is thinking about moving from voluntary to more mandatory things and trying to gauge what the political appetite for that is, and trying to do that in a way that includes a lot of education, because we know we need a lot of education in order to do some of that, but we're not going to get where we probably need to go given climate impacts and water supply challenges without having some more codes and development standards in place. And then rental housing. This is a new one for us. We've been doing lots of surveying of customers, and what we found, and it completely makes sense, is that for Fort Collins utilities, we have in our service area, there's about 40% of our housing units are rentals. So that's single family as well as multifamily. And there's a mismatch of incentives for people to participate in those programs. So we're missing a very large population from a residential standpoint. Account owners who pay the water bill are sometimes different than the property owner. The incentive or the desire to put long-term investments into a property is a little bit disjointed. There's all sorts of complexities there, and it looks different for lots of different rentals. So it's hard for us to find a solution to those rental property scenarios. And then last but not least, climate impacts. So not only will climate impacts supply, but climate impacts demands. As it gets hotter, drier, our landscapes need more water. So it's like this double whammy that we get from climate impacts. And a big question for us is, how do we match demand management to projected supply to ensure that we have a sustainable supply or a sustainable water future? I think it's my next and last slide. We're trying to do that through an update to our water efficiency plan. So a water efficiency plan is required from certain water providers by the state to be updated every 7 years. We are just starting to embark on our update. The bulk of our engagement work will happen in 2024. So if you don't hear anything for a while, it's not because we're not wanting to engage, but it's because we haven't quite got there. We've got a lot of groundwork to lay first. But there's a lot of things we want to do with that. We want to model climate impacts to demands, and we also want to model some water conservation efficiency strategies to determine what the potential is for savings and match that up with future supply models that we currently have related to climate impacts. We want to take an integrated water approach, and I think you heard from a previous presenter about integrating with land use planning. That's a huge piece. It's also a very challenging piece. And so I think there's an opportunity to do that, not only land use planning with external stakeholders, and then also internally with the other wet utilities. Stormwater plays a role in demand management. If you can capture more stormwater and leave it on your property, you don't have to use as much treated water, for instance. We want to do an equity analysis. We're definitely doing more equitable engagement than what we've done in the past, but an equity analysis portion of it would be ensuring that the strategies we're coming up with, we understand what that equity impact might be, and that we're looking for solutions that allow everybody, all customers, to participate in. So right now, a lot of our programs, you have to have money to participate. You have to be able to, spend a couple $1,000s to convert your landscape to get our $1,000 rebate, for instance. So looking for opportunities where, everyone has a chance to be more water efficient and to conserve water. I think I covered it all. Yes.
So are there some core elements that the Colorado law says have to show up
Yes.
in this plan?
These are the extra elements, aside from integrating with land use planning. That is a new core element that the state is requiring. So we're definitely gonna do all the core elements. It's a lot about, your water supply, profile and portfolio information. It's a list of all the things you're currently doing, a list of the things you wanna pursue. Identifying, different focus areas, having some metrics in place that you'll measure. We've been doing all of that and that's helpful to have. It'd be good to have an updated version of that. But we feel like we need to take it further for it to be a really useful resource for us and to really inform the decisions we're making and guide our work into the next 5 to 10 years.
All right, that's it. The change or cause.
Y'all the preference.
Doesn't matter.
Go for it, Todd.
Yeah, he likes to talk, Peter. Looking like the right place?
Yes, right there. At the beginning.
All right. It doesn't work on me.
Okay. Gonna give a quick overview, if you will, of City of Loveland water supply demands, sources, as well as then some of the challenges that we are facing moving forward. Similar to Marion and Fort Collins and probably a lot of towns and municipalities around the area, we're about half and half. I think that the thought was if you have some redundancy, if you're about half with native water and half with imported. And I would echo the sentiment, I don't think any town could lose half their water supply. We just don't have that much of a surplus that we could, take a 50% haircut in any given time. I think an interesting thing was we always thought that this was some redundancy, and that there was kind of all our eggs aren't in one basket, they're in 2 baskets, but it happens that our baskets are right next to each other. With fire, for instance, that it will jump over the continental divide. I mean, we will live, right? And so we don't have the reliability there that we want, or that we once thought, which is just one of the many kind of concerns that have begun evolving in terms of things that we thought were true are no longer maybe perhaps as true as we thought they were. And this then shows some of our facilities. You can see our water treatment plant in the foreground. Green Ridge Glade Reservoir, which is our main storage reservoir, about 7,000 acre foot in the background, where we can then also take water off of the Big Thompson River there. We share a diversion dam with an irrigation company. And looking again at our facilities from a Google Maps perspective, treatment plant, Green Ridge Glade, diversion dam where we take their water in. One point that's kind of unique is that the only way to get water into our reservoir is through the Charles Hanson feeder canal, which we don't know. And so we have an agreement that we get anytime there's excess capacity in that system, we get to use it, and then we pay for that usage. But we're entirely dependent on that component, that system that's owned by the Bureau of Reclamation. Kind of in a schematic view, the Trans Basin stuff through the Adams Tunnel, Windy Gap, CBT, Lake Estes down the river, Green Ridge Clay, water treatment plant, our Loveland pipeline, and then the Hanson feeder canal. To get water, we have to divert through the Dilly or Olympus into the canal and then take it down and take it out. This is, kind of our master plan, if you will. We completed our last master plan in 2020. And this is kind of it in a nutshell. This is kind of the entire thing. And what it shows here are projected demand in the blue, yellow, and then dotted. And we kind of have an envelope curve there, if you will, in terms of you know, what we think the most it's been, and a lower bound, and then kind of a middle bound. Then the red line represents our firm yield. So it's kind of what our supply is. Right now, we're sitting around 24. Our demands are around 14, 15. I think our peak demand was about 5 years ago, when it was about 15,000. But you know, Mariel talked about that variation in demand with climate, and it's, you know, it jumps up and down. We are a participant in Chimney Hollow, and we think that will provide us about another 4,000 acre foot of firm yield. And then we also have what we call Loveland Great Western, which is kind of a reuse reservoir. It's only a small, basically it's a gravel pond. A gravel pit that's been converted. But that will provide about another 1,500 acre foot. If we look out on our planning horizon, about 40 years to the year 2060, we think our total demand will grow to about 30,000 acre foot, and so that's what we've adopted as our target over this 40-year planning horizon. One thing you can kind of see about this is when you're trying to project 40 years into the future. It's hard. And things, it's kind of like driving a tanker, if you will. It moves so slowly. We can't, in terms of changing direction. Chimney Hollow took 25 to 30 years or more to get going. And so when you have that kind of project life, your ability to respond is also slow, retarded, if you will. So we have to try to look at that far out in advance. And we also have to give ourselves a pretty healthy buffer so that because you know, nobody wants to turn on their tap and water itself.
What is RWSR swaying? If firm yield projection, the red line.
Raw water.
Oh, raw water surface yield analysis.
Thank you.
Yes. Yes. We have like most municipalities, we have a big computer model where we run these simulations on what will happen. We look back over a historical period of record. And say, well, this is what the hydrology variation has been both in the native water and in water. And to throw it all together in this big computer simulation. But and that's where families and others.
How does your residential and commercial growth square with those forecasts for the next 30 years?
We assume it'll be somewhat of a mix, I think, in this analysis, that it will be consistent with the current land that we have. And that kind of leads to this next point. Mariel talked about Fort Collins being at build out, and we're not, but we will be. And we think that our build out, we're bounded on all sides by other purveyors and federal land. We think we'll hit our build out around that 2060. So our next master plan will then kind of look over the horizon. Once we move from build out to build up, what does that look like? And there'll be a difference in terms of projected growth. So kind of the overview then, the main points. We have currently planned, we have a plan in place, if you will, to get to 30,000 acre foot of firm yield by the year 2060. That'll or our service population of around 152 to 155, whichever comes first. That will get us close to build out. And then on the other side, we'll see something a little different. We do, like all municipalities, we revise and re-examine this about every 10 years. Just because things change and you're trying to look out so far in advance, you kind of have to come back and reassess. But we do think our current portfolio is diverse, and quite robust. We have a pretty good cushion.
Your computer models, do they give you some minimum confidence level, like 80% for the 30,000 acre feet?
Yes. In our case, our criteria, our shortage criteria, that we use is the 1 in 100 year event. So 1 in 100 year drought. Different people have different ones. Some places it's firm yield. I don't want to ever see a shortage, at least in the records you're analyzing, or 1 in 50 or something else. But in our case, we use 1 in 100. Right? That's kind of the target. Future water supply projects, then, to get us to the 30. Some of these we kind of were shown on the graphics. The main one's Chimney Hollow. That's our big heavy lifter, if you will. We also have change cases, so we'll be continuing to convert its share. And part of that's to keep that balance of in-basin versus trans-basin. Our Great Western Reservoir is in the works. There is a possibility of an expansion of our Green Ridge Glade Reservoir. It's not a big expansion, but it would give us another couple of feet there of storage. And sometimes every little bit helps. Water conservation, I think, is going to take an increasingly more stronger role in our overall portfolio as we move forward. As well, regional cooperation. There's certainly some opportunities to work with neighbors, and it's always kind of been water is a zero-sum game. It's yours or mine, but it's not ours. If you get more, then I get less. And that's still largely true, but nevertheless, within that, there's opportunities for 1 and 1 to make 3 on occasion. And where we see those, we certainly want to be able to take advantage. Top issues, supply reliability. We talked a little bit about we talked about the model, and we go back and we look at 50 years of hydrologic data, and we'll even extend that with tree rings and maybe try to get 500 years of data. But if the climate is changing, well, that's out the window. It's a different. Everything we thought we know, we don't know. I think the one kind of thing in our favor here is that climate change too is a slow move. And so we'll have some time to adapt. But we don't know yet, really. I don't think we're not very confident what it is we're adapting for. So most of the master plans you see to date that look at climate change, they kind of take a wait and see attitude. It's hard to know. It will be wetter. I think that the preponderance is it'll be tougher in terms of overall water supply. The heat will, if nothing else, we'll see less water and the timing will change. And those things, it's probably not going to be a good thing. But some models do project increased precipitation and so forth. That may somewhat offset that. But, our systems are built for this climate. Not for. Colorado River Basin issues are similar to climate change in that they could be a big deal and somewhat more alarming because they could happen much more quickly than we can see them. We can, I was the federal government just released their plans for the lower basin the other day. Nobody kind of knew what those were, and even still, we're not sure which of those plans it's going to do, and if it's gonna end up in court and all these things. And so just that inability to predict adds risk to everything. Which then we go back and we just get bigger margin. Because we don't wanna, we don't wanna put our systems at risk. So there's a cost for uncertainty, if you will. And fire is similar. Fire is a new frontier in terms of the size and the range. And we certainly saw impacts to our water supply in the last several years, and we expect to for the few years to come. In terms of just not being able to take water. We're very excited about our supply development, Chimney Hollow, and we think water conservation is that, has that offered it that kind of opportunity to be a big buffer for us in terms of to weather some of these changes that might happen, whether it's climate or fire or Colorado River Basin issues. And then growth. There's always a concern if it accelerates, we're so slow to react, we may not be able to catch up. And that's part of the reason we try to stay ahead of the game and always keep a buffer. So that if we see something there, we can react. That's it.
How close? When's the estimated readiness date for Chimney Hollow?
I think the last I've heard is, we got about 2.5 more years of construction and then filling, and they're gonna do some pre-positioning of water and some of those sorts of things. That'll help it. I would guess it's 5 to 7 years. It's full and up and running. Would kind of be my guess right now. Yes.
You had in your graph that was showing the supply and demand, you had some different scenarios for demand. I was wondering to what extent, you mentioned all the uncertainty with climate change.
Right.
To what extent you're using scenario planning for supply as well?
We do. We look at, and we have modeling in that, but it's all presupposed, it's somewhat hypothetical. And a lot of it's worst case, because you have not much else to go by. And so we do look at, what if, and our models look at, well, what if, stream flows are reduced by 20% and different kind of tiers of reductions. And the same with imported water. And part of that is also to reflect any, throttling that we might see as a result of the total basin issues. But yeah, they're just guessing.
Okay, you ready? Okay, good morning, I'm Shane Harrell, I'm Windsor's town manager. I usually like to start these off with a little icebreaker joke, but unfortunately, all I've heard lately are jokes about unemployment, and none of them really work, so we're gonna in here. So, yeah, I'm the town manager, so I've rely on the young elite wrestling for a lot of the analysis if somebody's engaged in him. But I'll answer questions that I can do. So a little bit overview of the town of Windsor. So if you know, here's County Road 392 here, here's 257. We have basically 3 water providers in town. We have the town itself that's in the dark blue section. We also rely on North Water or basically north of Harmony Road. We have a couple little enclaves here, but basically anything north of Harmony. And then anything west of County Road 13 is Fort Collins Lumber Water District. And so the problem we're trying to solve in our water supply is really the dark blue mat there. So when you look at our yield, unlike our larger neighbors, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a couple more slides, but we've been really relying on Colorado Big Thompson for so many years that the town of Windsor's just been really a small town. And so we've never really had the resources to go and develop these really big reservoir projects, these really big public works. We basically, as development has come in, they've dedicated Colorado Big Thompson to the town. And so it's been kind of the Cadillac, the gold standard. But it's made us really reliable on the source. So when you look at these curves here, that the dark gray is Big Thompson. The red is, North Dakota Irrigation Company, which is also called Big Thompson, so it's the same thing, right? We've also added in a couple others. So just last year, we had a change of pace with Lick. So that's a Greeley level irrigation canal. So that's what's yellow. And then we also added last year, an agreement with the city of Greeley, where we have 350 acre feet of water that we can lease if we have a drought. So it's just a little bit of a drought supply. So that's it. And then the big purple thing here is NISP. So we don't have that yet, but that basically shows why this matters to the town. So when you look at our population demand in basically the area that we're trying to serve in the dark blue, that's here. So at a 70% yield with Colorado Big Thompson, then we have enough water. If at a 60% yield with Colorado Big Thompson, or what we usually planning yield, we barely have enough. And if for population, we have a firm yield, even with that, we're still a little bit short. So, yes, sir.
Did Save the Food file suit against NISP yet?
I
No,
haven't
not
heard
yet.
they've dropped that lawsuit yet, but we know it's imminent, right? And we know, and I'm not gonna talk tons about NISP other than about like 85% of my presentation. But, you know, this has been a planning project that it's been underway for 18 years, right? I mean, the Fed said that it's the most environmentally friendly way to get the water, you know? And as we look at, you know, how does water come in? And we can talk about, you can buy and dry. Okay, that's not really that environmentally friendly, right? You can do a trans mountain diversion from somebody else, which is maybe not that environmentally friendly for them. You know, right? So water resources do we have? So anyway, I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but as you see, this matters a lot to the town of Windsor and to a lot of other communities. One thing we have in Windsor that most people don't have is a non-potable requirement. So if you develop in Windsor, you must develop a non-potable supply. You have to water all your irrigation with the non-pot system. It started in '94, actually, the developer then, I think, said, hey, look, I'd rather just use natural supplies than continue to pay the town for your CBT rights. So we piloted it then, and after about we saw at the time, and I think a lot of times Colorado data shows that about half the water goes to outdoor water usage. Maybe that percentage will go up and down a little bit, but about half the water goes outside. So we piloted it in Water Valley and it worked so well, we basically codified it in 2003 and we made that requirement. So now any new construction must have it. The systems are privately managed, so these are not town non-pot systems. These are owned by the HOA, the developers. It's basically required anywhere in town and it is a condition for annexation as well. You can see everybody likes a good bar graph, right? And you know, any graph. So here you see our renewable systems have really been on the rise. I don't have the slide, but so we know Fort Collins, who's been really aggressive and really a leader in water conservation. They've gotten down their per capita use to 139 gallons per person per day. Who wants to guess what Windsor's is, other than Scott Ballstad? 180. Okay, good.
80.
You're both wrong. You're much closer. 90. 90 gallons per person.
Because
per
you're
day.
not watering outside.
That's right. But again, so when you talk about water use in the area, I don't know any other community that's that low per person. So, oh, you're this way. All right. So benefits, you know, obviously the ditch company and ag users keep the water in the ditch. We keep on pulling that water through for them. It stretches the capacity of our water treatment plants. We reduce our peak summer demand. So this is a benefit and a negative for us. You know, we have really what's called a hardened demand because so much of our water use is indoors. Techniques like doing outdoor water restrictions don't really work in Windsor. Most of that outdoor water is non-potable, right? And then we also have two other water suppliers. So if the town of Windsor says we're going to do that, we're just hitting this little number of people that were there before we had our non-potable system. That still doesn't impact North Weld water or Fort Collins water customers, right? And I think the biggest impact is that it keeps the water in the river, right? And so when you have these exchanges, and so if you have somebody who's been watering corn, they have return flow requirements. They've had a consumptive use and they have to return that water. When we take over that water rider, I guess when the developer does and puts it on a new crop, which is just the landscaping, those return flow requirements are still there, right? So you don't really impact downstream users. And then there's obviously environmental benefits. I think they're just not treating water, spending all the money and the chemicals and everything to just put it on grass. So I think there's a lot of benefits to the program. So I'm gonna shift a little bit. So since 2000, we've had 360% growth. Nobody here knows it, but Scott Ballstat turns 24 this week. That's how. And as a couple people mentioned, Colorado Big Thompson is no longer an option for us. When I started less than 5 years ago, we were collecting $25,000 for Colorado Big Thompson shares. That was our cash and live. We said $25,000 will get it done. You know, I mean, it's like Bitcoin. CBT is like 90,000 now, right? I mean, I wish I could have just taken my ICMA account and just. That's not an option. Not only is it prohibitively expensive, but it's just going away. You know, over time as these farmers have retired and sold it, now everybody who holds them, the municipalities, we're never gonna sell. You're never gonna sell a Colorado Big Thompson, right? So, it's going away for us and it's going away for everybody. Now it's not working. Thanks. So it is a little bit hard for us. I bring up this to just kind of illustrate. I think that the Greeley and Fort Collins just grew before we did. Obviously, Loveland did as well. So back in the early 1900s, they're doing work, right? They're purchasing property. Boyd Lake in 1905. I mean, what do you think the regulatory requirements were, right? I mean, the mayor of Greeley goes up in a backhoe and starts digging a hole or something. There's no way it was that hard to do that. Obviously, Seaman was in the 40s. And in 1970, there, the population of 38,000. So in Fort Collins, you know, they constructed Joe Riley in 1905. In 1970, they hit that 43,000 population. And Joe Riley was expanded in the 1980s. And so they did all these massive public works projects 50 years ago or 100 years ago, right? And so as we come into this regulatory environment, and now I just bring up these 1970 populations, because that's more or less where the town of Windsor was in 2020, right? Kind of around that 40,000 mark. Now we're in a place where we wouldn't have to rely on Colorado Big Thompson. We're actually big enough where we can like bond and develop things and do projects. The problem is our project has been missed, and we've been, please do the next slide. So we've been in that project for almost 20 years. What we're looking for the town of Windsor, so the yield 3,300 acre feet. So that's about 33,000 more people. That's town manager math. Don't ask anybody else, but that's about right. Our number for that right now is about 150 million. Again, when I started 5 years ago, our estimated cost was 90 million. And I fell out of my chair then. And now it's like, never mind, it's 150 million.
You got a plus on there, Shane. You got a plus.
Yeah, I'm going to do that. Yeah, maybe. Well, that's because I did this slide 2 days ago, and I'm sure that it's gone up since then. We did get our record decision last year, which was big. You know, it was, you know, barely got across the finish line. But this is why it matters. You know, one is we know that in northern Colorado, the population is going to double by 2050, right? I mean, people are coming here. And where are they going to go? I mean, so in a lot of people who work in Fort Collins and Loveland and Greeley live in Windsor, right? And same the other way, right? A lot of people who live in Fort Collins work in Windsor and everywhere. So we know we have the people coming. And we also know in 2018 that NISP was the most sustainably, environmentally friendly way for us to develop this water. So if not for NISP, what is our reasonable alternative, right? I mean, Greeley's, you know, bought the Terry Ranch project. So I guess you could buy a major aquifer in Wyoming. There's one option for you. Yeah. So what's left for it? Or it's just buy and drive. And so again, if we know that all the participants have identified 40,000 acre feet of need, if this project doesn't happen, the only other way for us to get the water to satisfy the people that we know are coming is just buy and drive, which doesn't have any protections, right? We just buy, we just transfer the water. There's no mitigation for the Poudre River. There's nothing but just taking the water the way we've always done it. So, you know, I look at it as, you know, that professor Hawking said, you know, people think a dilemma is a choice between things that are fun. Like, I don't know who to do a prom with. Billy asked me and he's cute. Reggie has a nice guitar, right? And that wasn't my actual prom dilemma, but what? But a dilemma is a choice between two equally unappealing things, right? I either cut my arm off here or I die in the crag of the rock, you know? And for us, I think sometimes these water choices are actually dilemmas, right? Because you can't get environmentally zero right? Definitely building later as, or it's gonna be a negative environmental impact.
Or they're trilemmas,
What's that?
or they're trilemmas, they're multiple headed.
Okay, well, thank you. I know you're a very intelligent person by listening earlier, things that I've learned to do work, so thank you. So yeah, there's, this is definitely at least a dilemma, if not a sex dilemma. I don't know. So if we don't develop late, then what's our options, right? We just buy and ride. And next slide. And then we did touch a little bit on regional collaborations. So like I said, we did get an IGE with Greeley, to get some reliable drought supply. We're also talking to the city of Loveland. We're talking to Fort Collins Loveland Water District, a little bit to Fort Collins, but, anyway, we're just trying to talk to our regional partners about, hey, look, if you've got a water supply till 2060, 2070, 2100, is there a way to make our system a little bit more resilient? Because we have all these interconnects, we have all this connectivity between our systems. We are getting ready to build another interconnect for Fort Collins Loveland Water District. Again, this builds just a nice resilient network for everybody. And then we're also planning to construct a new treatment plant with Fort Collins Loveland Water District in the towns of Severance and Eden. So, and then we've done the same, this water strat off that Claire could probably tell you about over a bottle of whiskey. It's been a big collaborative effort with Fort Collins, Loveland, Greeley, Windsor, and we brought in a lot of partners, a lot of water providers to really talk about these very things. You know, how can we partner together? Is there a way to kind of get those 1 + 1 = 3 kind of conversations? And those have been kind of 2 steps forward and 9 steps back, and then, I don't know, I think we're doing a tango, but it's been. And I think maybe that's my last slide. Yeah, so thank you.
We kind of see Windsor as a bit more of a catalyst for regional cooperation on water than other cities, or about the same as other cities.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we have been, just because we're needier than other places. You know, I mean, we really have been sort of relying on Colorado big comps. And so I think we're big enough to get at the table with a lot of our other local entities, and small enough to really need the help. You know, so I think we're in a good place. And yeah, so I think, but I don't know about catalysts. I think, you know, it kind of takes two. And so we've been needy, but what's really helpful is having the leaders and these other agencies being willing to take the meetings and really hear us out and get to yes. And that can be hard. Yes?
Your Northern Colorado water strata and your tango comment. So I love the philosophy and approach of the 1 + 1 is 3. And I know that's achievable. When do you think that realistically we can see positive net gains and outcomes from this collaboration? Because it takes time.
It does. And so, you know, I think the wins we're seeing immediately, they're not the big public, these 20 entities figure something out. Is all the relationship building that we're doing. You know, we've made more gains with Fort Collins Loveland Water District just from having Chris Pletcher in that room and just putting a name to the face and having these conversations with him one-on-one. And so I think that the 15-minute meetings before the meeting and these things after the lunches have been highly beneficial for us. So I think we're going to see a lot of these other kind of side things happen as far as having this big group come up with something other than like, I don't know. Because it's hard, because there are, you know, you think about, for me, I work for a council of 7 people. Every other city manager works for a council of 7 people in there. And then you bring in all the water districts that have 7 or 9 board members, right? And so you have maybe 15 working shifts that represent 125 or 150 other opinions out there. And so it's hard. And even though we have the political will right now to have these conversations, water is just something where everybody's just going really slow and really untrusting. Because the water strata started out with 4 larger entities, we actually were getting a lot of pushback. The first water strata meetings, until we found out the perceptions from some of our water providers were that this was really kind of being mandated by the municipalities. Like, we're telling the water district, you shall do these things, right? And they had their hackles up, and rightly so. We would never do that. We really couldn't do that. But it's just kind of dancing through that. So for the big group, I would say, ask me that question a year from now, and I'm gonna still hedge. But I think for the small little side conversations, we're already making some really good traction.
Question, and then it's talking about regional relationships, you know. You work for Collins, but are there regional activities going on in water conservation?
Yeah, there are, you know, I'm not at the strat off level by any means, but, you know, we meet regularly with Elko and Fort Collins Loveland Water District. We meet even more regularly with Fort Collins Loveland Water District to talk specifically about water resources and water conservation. That's a quarterly meeting that we have together. And we've made some progress. You know, we've figured out ways to provide or extend some of our water conservation programs beyond our service area in a kind of fee for service type agreements between some of the other water providers. So for instance, our sprinkler checkup program, which we historically only offered within our service area, we over the years extended it to Elko, extended to Fort Collins Loveland Water District within our city limits, and then it was about 5 years ago, expanded that. So now we offer sprinkler checkups for those customers, whether they're in city limits or not. And they pay us a fee for service for that. So there's a charge for each sprinkler checkup we do for each of their customers. And that's worked out really well. And we've been having conversations about opportunities to scale that same approach or method with other programs we have. But it's hard because they have different resources than we do, different cultures. There's a lot of differences, different water portfolios. And so I haven't seen any opposition to regionalism or having those collaborative conversations, but it's still moving. I think that's just like a little microcosm of maybe what you are all experiencing at the strata level.
Your questions?
I have a question about the loss, so probably more for you, because you have that in one part of the slide deck. Is the water, I understand it's highly grossly inefficient to treat the water and lose it out of your system. I get that. But where do those droplets of water end up? I mean, are they totally lost, or is it sort of an inefficient recharge system for the groundwater? And when you look at the cumulative effect of all the systems, there's having some loss factor.
We're not using groundwater for our water source, so I don't know if there's aquifers or somewhere where there's recharge for.
Are there, I mean, there's probably some farmers or ranchers using wells or something, and in other words, the water is still getting used.
If for nothing else, I mean, I'm not like a soil scientist, and this is kind of outside of my area.
Just answer it anyway.
But there are factors related to soil moisture, right? That if you have more moist soil, it will hold that moisture longer. Even if it's down farther beyond the root system, it can rise with heat and temperature and get to those roots. So I think
It's still there.
there's got to be still some level of benefit to the urban landscape. But, you know, probably not, you're not capturing everything.
Except most water mains are under pavement, right?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, but it's probably not staying static, you know, it's moving.
In most, I mean, when you're talking about unbilled water and the losses in most cities, you know, it's obviously following the infrastructure, which typically follows the roadways. And one of the things that's starting to see in a lot of cities is like, gosh, there's a lot of trees along. And
That's what I see the city's water loss, that's water.
you know, it is, it's, you know, kind of going to urban greenery for the most part. Fort Collins is a little unique in that there's a lot of ditches through town. And my guess is that some of it will end up back in those ditches. So in the winter time, I was walking around and looking at all the ditches in our neighborhood. It's like you could almost guess where you're having water leaks because there's the pond water.
But it's all anecdotal, there's no science that's recapturing.
No, actually, there's a lot of cities and a lot of firms in Texas in particular
that have evolved quite the industry in leak detection and actually tracing where leaks are going. That has created its own problem because the second somebody says, okay, there's a leak here and you're losing 1% of your water through this leak. And then there's sort of this hue and cry that you gotta go fix the leak. And then again, where do water mains usually follow? Streets. And what does that mean for the street? Rip up the street and fix the main. And so there's an interesting dance that the utilities have of going with the leak detection, understanding where the water's going, and then actually trying to do something comparatively, because at certain percentages, from a cost standpoint, it just makes no sense whatsoever. It's only when you're getting big ones. Now, there have been some really interesting work. I know a study in Buffalo where they weren't doing it, so detecting the leaks so much for, coming up with quantity of water. We're using it for predictive large failure systems. So that they're actually looking at tracking leaks and starting to say, you're gonna have a massive failure here. So you better get out and fix this now, as opposed to others, which are just sort of like this, what is fairly acceptable in the industry in terms of leaks in the system and unbuilt water.
Which typically wouldn't get worse, it's just kind of part of that system.
Yeah, and that's where you're trying to figure it out. But there's a huge industry out there in terms of leak detection right now, and understanding where the water's going. And it's sort of like, how are you gonna use it for utility? Because it is just completely not cost effective to, to try to plug every leak.
So let's thank our panel. And are we ready to set up for lunch?
Yep, lunches are all lined up out in the.
So we'll give you about 15 minutes. We'll start a little bit late. Oh, done.
Great. I don't know which one's the single, this one.
The more you go. You guys are. I always laugh at water. Something that I only established that is unless the water district goes to these other sources. Simple plan. I'm surprised you guys. And if you do it all right, it's not good. It's like, I mean, right when it's built. Here's all these changes on top of the regulations. I mean, even my plans. Yeah, it's right. It's walking.
It's not right.
It's just. Yeah, you just gotta know, you gotta know the long term. That's just kind of another thing I'm gonna do, so I want Yeah, it's just like, they'll change their minds, probably as, you know, those guys, they'll change their minds.
You didn't know. Yeah.
Yeah, you can come the next day.